Out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. All right, this is a collaborative episode, more of a discussion than maybe we originally intended, but I think it was still fruitful and great actually. It's a collaboration with Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. Me and Russell sat down with Jared from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism and basically just went over like we thought through the term white supremacy, thought through organized white supremacy and its usage today, and how white supremacy has become a way to describe any form of white aggression. We walked through a little bit of history. We reviewed the episodes we've been doing, obviously on the Klan, and this is probably our last one for those of you who might want to be hearing about other topics. But it was important to study these things, so we do more of a discussion. It's pretty wide ranging, so I'm not going to really say much. It's not a typical myth. That's why there's not a myth titled for it, as there is in other podcasts. But I do think it's just as good. So gonna play that for y'all. It's fairly long, longer than even the other ones we've done. We're gonna also try to get back to shorter episodes. I guess our America First episode wasn't that bad. We actually kept that under 2 hours, but yeah, it's one of our end of the year reflections kind of episodes, so I think it works. And then there'll be one last one very quickly in the next few days on the a year review. Won't be very long, and then we'll be back at it next month, hopefully dealing with the question of violence in the civil rights movement. We'll see how that shapes out. Still working on that. I do want to shout out the patrons real quick before we let this episode play. We didn't do much recording, so forgive me. I gotta go back a few ways to check, but there was Hegelmatic that signed up. Shout out to Hegelmatic. There was Ashton Green that signed up. ATL Acolyte, shout out to them. They upgraded. Steve Smith signed up as a listener. And a few others that I'm probably missing signed up. So shout out to y'all. And definitely keep the pages coming in. Again, we don't do the greatest promotion on here. So I definitely appreciate that we even have patrons, and thank y'all for continuing to support the show. Other than that, again, wasn't going to be long here. Going to get into it. So yeah, enjoy the episode. Peace.
All right, so welcome everybody. This is a Millennials Are Killing Capitalism and Black Miss podcast collaboration. We've collaborated before, but this is the first time we're officially doing it as both platforms. So you all have been engaged in a long discussion of white supremacy, white supremacist groups, particularly looking at the Klan and the 3 waves or phases of the Klan. Actually, I think you're up to 4 waves now.
Basically.
Yeah, I mean, you all have certainly dedicated more time to this topic than I have, but also I think you've studied white supremacy more than about 99% of white people, except for the white supremacists themselves, and maybe a few, a few scholars, but not many, as I know that's one of the things. Rasul, and of course we're here with Rasul Moat, who I hope folks know at this point, but co-author of Laundering Black Rage with Too Black, and been on the show. This is, I think, the 3rd time that we've collaborated with you. So yeah, so Too Black, I'll let you kind of, say what you want to on the intro as well.
Yeah, so we did, like you said, we did originally. I don't even remember. I think originally the myth was, for those who aren't familiar with our show, for any chance, Black Myths Podcast, we take myths related to and or about Black folks, African people, and we debunk them. The myths that are socio-political nature, so there's not going to be just kind of random fact Jeopardy kind of things. Like, we try to deep dive into things. So this one in particular started with, for a while, from Indiana. And I had always heard growing up here, and when I travel even more so, that the Klan started in Indiana, and it did not. It started in Pulaski, Tennessee. And depending on the date, 1865, it really didn't get going until 1867. And then there are three different waves of the Klan. A lot of people tend to just kind of throw them all together. They take like from each era and just kind of create a synthesis of a Klansman or whatever. So there was the after, and they tend to arise after wars, really. But there was the era after the Civil War. That's why I say 1865. The actual federal government squashed them with the assistance of Black militias, squashed that one. It pretty much dies around 71. You don't really, and when we say it dies, it's not to say there's not a Klansman somewhere, like Russell said one episode. It doesn't mean they don't have their robes in their attics, or they might have little meetings, but they had no influence after this point. And then you see 1915, Birth of a Nation drops. The Klan itself doesn't really catch on like in a major way until 1920-ish. But that movie reconstitutes the Klan and gives them energy, along with other social political factors that we dealt with in that episode related to like industrialization and immigration, that nature. And the thing about each wave is the Klan has different political objectives in each wave. And that's what and these things just get flattened. It's just white supremacy. They're just like rednecks. So the first one was the Klan started in Indiana. That was the myth. And the second one was the KKK was a poor white movement, because we demonstrated it was actually a very petty bourgeois middle class in terms of the rank and file. And that the second wave wasn't even primarily interested in like, Black people were not the main targets. It's not that we were shown love, but we were not the main targets of that era. It was actually so-called Catholics and people who were, because it was a very like white Protestant movement. So Catholics and Jews and people of that nature, and East European immigrants, those were the folks that were the primary targets. And that's when the Klan reached its peak. That's when they had like 6 to 8 million members, probably higher. A bunch of scandals. That's when it actually was big in Indiana, and Indiana had the biggest Klan, I think. What was it? There's 92 counties in this state. 89 of 92 counties had a Klan chapter at one point. And 1/3 of all Protestant-born white men were in the Klan in Indiana at one point. That fell apart due to scandals with Lucy Stevenson. And by the 1930s, it doesn't really have much going for it. And then it revives itself in the 1950s, around the time the civil rights movement is upcoming. And that's where you start seeing the poor white participation. So the myth with that was the Klan are men of their time. And we dealt with what would be considered the third wave, which is one of the looser waves, to describe. And then after that, that dies off I don't know. It really depends on how you kind of interpret the history. So that the height of it dies off in the mid-60s, 1960s. It doesn't really fully die off right into the early 70s. Then you have a resurgence going from the late 70s into the 80s, and that's about where we are at now. We dealt with some of this history when we talked about the Greensboro massacre that happened in 1979 in Greensboro, California, North Carolina. And that's where you start seeing the different groups that people will call white supremacist groups start to come together. It's not the first time, but it was one of the major moments where Nazis and Klansmen took part in a massacre. And it was mainly, again, a massacre, not actually aimed mainly at Black folks, but it was aimed at communists at the time. Communists who admittedly were not very bright, because they held a rally called Death to the Klan, and they didn't have any guns at the rally. So, that didn't end well. And then there becomes this turn where white power becomes a movement. I'm skipping a lot, so Russell will fill in, but I'm just trying to give people a brief history. Um, and white power under kind of a banner of different like I guess lanes or different expressions of what people call white supremacist groups, whether that's the Klan, whether that's the Nazis, whether that's these more like anti federal government types, these militia types. They all start coming together, and that's where you get like the rise of like Aryan Nation, and then even later into the '90s, you get the skinheads who were not a part of this iteration I'm talking about now, but in the '90s they start coming in, and they take a position that the United States government is against white people. You know, and they have to take a revolutionary position to overthrow the government. So most people, as we can, I guess, and I'm curious what you thought, Jared, tend to not really deal with the nuances of this. We usually, on the so-called left, look at these groups as not really a threat, or we think that it's just about hate, or we think that they're kind of cartoonish, and there's not really a lot of research and study, particularly from like our side of the aisle, on this shit. So for us, it felt important because there's a lot of people throwing out words about fascism and white supremacy is on the rise, but then have no real commentary on these groups. And do think the Klan started in Indiana. Do think the Klan is a bunch of just poor rednecks. Don't really understand what motivates them. Don't really understand what their grievances are. And then I think more in this episode, I'm interested in exploring like how do their ideas maybe get transferred to the broader society, even if people don't know that they're picking them up. How do they maybe in some ways, I was talking to Russell about maybe in some ways even get laundered, kind of co-opted in a way in some cases. Um, and also just dealing with some more of the history because we really stopped around the 80s. So I think there's more to explore with that. So I hope that gives people some clarity on like what we've been trying to do. I could say more on maybe the motivations for it, but that's just an overview of what actually we've covered.
Yeah, I mean, so I've watched all of it, which I encourage people to do. Um, it is a good bit, so maybe like don't watch it all at once like I did, but but yeah, I mean, I think it's great, and I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting too is like the way that in certain phases you all demonstrate that you know in certain phases they're not the most dangerous group, right?
Right.
And like I would say that like today, right? It's not the Klan that actually is the most dangerous, organized, you know, organization of white supremacy or violence today. And I think that's it is something I think that people often. I mean, I know one of the things we're going to talk about is this kind of generic version of white supremacy too, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I think even when we're talking about white supremacist groups or white nationalist groups or the Klan or neo Nazis, right? That there is this kind of like, okay, we'll lump them all together because they all really want the same thing.
And they've all somehow always gotten along, which, as we show in our episodes, is not true either.
Right.
Yeah.
Or even like one of the things I think is important within the work you all are doing too is to show during different phases what is the relationship like to the state? What is their relationship like to different political parties? Because that's the thing is that the thing that I think is really important, as I sat with all of it too, to think about, right, is that they're organized groups, right? And so then they have an ideology, they have politics, right? And then they're organizing to try to enact those in different ways, right? And the ways that they might organize have to do with how many members that they have. I mean, and there's a relationship between these things too, right? Because if they're too fringe with their ideology, it may be more difficult for them, to organize. or to have like mass organization, right? And so there's also, I say that to say also there's different periods in which they're able to create a kind of mass politics also, right? That then, you talk about like the second wave, right? That is able to bring in a lot of different, members, because they're appealing to, they're able to strike a chord with their politics that goes much further. And I mean, I know that in part we'll probably talk about, Trump or, Trumpism or whatever in this moment, which I think, is really a bad term, right? Because there's a whole bunch of different, coalition of a bunch of different forces that are involved in what brings somebody like Trump into power. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that we can kind of flatten this, and I think there are, which we'll get into, but there are reasons why flattening it to some extent makes a certain kind of analytic sense, but not if you're actually trying to like understand it in order to defeat it, right? And unless you're just saying, well, like, let's vote for the Democratic Party because they're going to save us from all of that, right? Which I think is a lot of, unfortunately, why in some ways you get that kind of flattening sometimes, right? Is because the solution that's being proposed very often by folks who do a lot of flattening is liberal politics, right? Is these kind of democratic, politics. And so, um, in that sense, it benefits them to say everybody who's on that side, uh, is kind of this homogenous thing that's against all of us, this inclusive group of people.
Yeah, everyone's a
Um,
white supremacist in that party, but then even I think on the left, you have this knee jerk reaction to then follow the same logic of, well, okay, but we have white supremacists in the Democratic Party too. And I think people, what they're trying to do is demonstrate that, the Democratic Party or the left or whatever you want to call it is not all perfect, but I think you just end up stretching the term white supremacy to a point where it has no meaning. When you just try to say anyone and everybody who is racist is a white supremacist, at some point, what's the meaning of it?
yeah, it calls to mind actually this. I don't know. I mean, this is. I don't want to go too far down road of sidetracks, but like, Jill Stein was on the Breakfast Club. I don't know if y'all remember this, and she called. I don't remember the one. Was it Angela Ree? Maybe like she called one of the women who's on the Black Breakfast Club, who's a black woman, right? She said you're supporting white supremacy by supporting Kamala Harris, right? She's a white woman saying this, right? And like, I think what she was saying, right? It actually, I mean, some people liked it, right? Including some black people liked it, right? Because she was talking about the Democratic Party's relationship you know, to white supremacy in that way that it gets talked about on the left, right? But like the optics of it also didn't, I mean, I don't think it sat well with the majority of black viewers to have this older white lady also saying, like, you black woman who's voting for another black woman are voting for the politics of white supremacy. And I, as this elder white woman, is the one that's going to lead you to the anti-racist. And I mean, like on some level, politically, we might argue that, right? But like it also because I think this watering down of white supremacy to that degree, right, where it's like, okay, well now you're saying that, all these black folks are participating in white supremacy by voting for a Democrat against Donald Trump, right? Like that, now we're in a place where this is really kind of
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also just moralistic, right? Like that's what's annoying about all. It's very moralistic. Again, I don't really care about that interaction person. Like I'm like, if you want to tell Angela Rye anything negative, that doesn't really bother me. but, but I'm saying at the same time, like it's 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 the way people retort the argument. Like, well, you're supporting white supremacy if you support this. You're supporting white supremacy if you support this. And even though what's funny about that is even though we're saying that white supremacy is more than these groups that we're talking about, the moralist argument is still trying to make it like, oh, you support a Nazi, like you support this very like dark image of these like, murderous, genocidal people. Like you're not getting at so even if they're trying to say it's this more sophisticated kind of like white supremacy as a system or something, like you're really still just saying like you support like Hitler, right? It's just, it kind of has that kind of vibe to it. Like you support Hitler, and we know Hitler is just an easy way to make anyone seem bad is if you say Hitler. And Hitler, similar to Trump in some ways, becomes just a lightning rod for whatever position. If you can get on the other side of that, you've taken the moral high ground. So so even for the people who have tried to make white supremacy a more academic term, a more analytical term, I don't think that project has failed broadly, even if I was to give credence to it, because it's still turned into a very like moralistic retort more than I think anything else. Like I don't think the point of understanding it as a broader system that a lot of those scholars are attempting to get at, I don't think it necessarily resonates, because up until the 2010s, the mass majority of us understood white supremacy that weren't in like certain spaces. Like if you were in like black conscious spaces or something, you might thought of white supremacy differently. But the mass majority of people who just walk around every day thought of white supremacy as the Klan or the Nazis or Aryan. That was the way they conceived of it. They didn't really have maybe a good understanding of those groups, but they at least associated them with skinheads and, Nazi tattoos and stuff. They didn't think about white supremacy as necessarily like Barack Obama or whatever. Now, there's a good case for it, but I'm just saying like that's not how most people. So we've not really been able to get that image out of people's brains, even when we say it means something more than that anyway. Russell, I guess, did you want to have anything to say about he's just sitting here listening about about just like the project we've taken on, and then we can, I guess, just deal with this white supremacy question and move on.
Yeah, I was getting comfortable representing the audience, just sort of like, man, it's really interesting, good points. Yeah, all right, yeah. No, but I think I'll try to tie in even both of you all's reaction with my own sort of thoughts, in the sense that, some people may know, but I know Two Black is more probably aware of this, is that, I DJ, I've been DJing for, I don't know, since 1984. How is this relevant? Well, it's relevant in the way in which, if I'm seeking, if back then, if I'm seeking ways in which to sort of procure more music, how would I go about doing that? If I'm trying to put people on to, more music, how would I sort of go about doing that? And I think from, those experiences, it developed, at least for me, sort of a pursuit to, try to get at some clarity, or not only clarity, but also breath and something, because sometimes, especially when I go out and listen to other DJs now, but also then, you would begin to sort of hear these things as it relates to the same song, right? The same songs repeatedly. And there's all these other songs that are not being played. And maybe the people who are, attending the space aren't even aware that there's these other songs that could be potentially played. And so while I may not DJ as much, now out in the open, I still enjoy, making my own, mixtapes, because really it's just a chance for me to hear all this other music that I enjoy, right? If I go and download somebody else's mixtape, I'm going to hear just the sort of like standard stuff. And so making the sort of, I guess, necessary relationship why I'm starting with this thing that seems to be completely foreign. I sit back and listen to news, listen to podcasts, listen to others, and you hear these terms of fascism come out. You hear these terms of white supremacy come out, and I'm hungry for information and I'm not getting it, right? And for me, the opportunity to sit down with the Black Myths over the 10-hour retreat, you know, was a way to somehow make a mixtape, right? To actually sort of, when I look out there, there's not enough books on this subject matter. There's not enough podcasts on this subject matter. And so I'm trying to, I'm out there trying to find that information from others instead of me needing to produce it, myself. But if you don't find it, then you, I think, have an obligation to produce it for others. And so that was at least, I think, a motivator for me to sort of take the call from Two Black and the rest of the Black Myths crew to, be engaged in this sort of 3 to 4 part, series focusing in on the history of the Klan, pushing me to sort of go beyond some of the information that I already had to sort of look for some more, try to put it together, especially again, since this information oftentimes is not even put together. There's, I think we alluded to it in some of the episodes that while there are some books on the second Klan, there's not as many books on the first Klan, but there still are books. But the third Klan is the one that really you begin to see.
Terrible.
Yeah, where you really see like there's only 2 or 3 books type of thing, right? I'm not saying there's only 2 and 3, but you begin to see
It's limited. It's
limited amount.
Yeah.
And then you begin to start searching for other things, lectures, and you begin to come across virtually nothing. Even before this, I just wanted to sort of look up, in terms of AI, not because I use it, but now it comes up automatically on Google. But I wanted to sort of look up just some of these concept points, and even AI was struggling to congeal a response to just some of the terms that I know I was going to use and bring to this space, which indicates that it wasn't enough on the internet for the AI to sort of pull from, summarize, and then spit back out. I mean, literally, it was like 3 paragraphs on white power violence. White power violence, specifically, I think I typed in white power violence 1990s. 3 paragraphs. I just dumbfounded. And so I guess for me, this is now just another attempt to flesh those things out.
You know what's as a
to-
quick
yeah.
aside, what's funny is I did that and they actually one of our episodes got referenced.
and it's just been made.
We just
It's made, and then that's sad. I mean, because again, like I love being a student. You know what I'm saying? I love to hear and listen to other people's work. When somebody has done incredible work, man, I'm like making notes and so on. I don't like, being the one that has to produce the thing. Like I want to be the person who's sitting in the classroom, so to learn from it. And so, it's just a roundabout way, but I hope it makes sense to people who are listening. One, that was the basis for it, but the realization in doing it just confirmed why we intended on doing it, because it's just not out there. It's not dealt with in any particular way, but we keep using the same terms. We keep calling something fascist and fascism. We keep calling something white supremacy. We keep sort of referring to the Klan and with its importance. It's still a thing, but yet no one has been, or not enough people have found it to be something to be curious about, to pursue more and to produce more a body of work and knowledge on it. So that's just, some of my initial sort of opening thoughts, and, especially in relationship to your respective opening thoughts.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. Yeah, Two Black, I'll just ask you, like, when you all wanted to start doing this on Black Myths, what was your thought process from your end on, wanting to study it? And I know you're always debunking a myth associated it, but it's clearly also that, since you've done 4 episodes on it already, that like there was something that, you wanted to spend some time really digging into this?
Well, I guess I don't know. There's a few things. I think on one level, I said it on a very like petty level. I just got tired of hearing people say the Klan started in Indiana. It just like annoys my, I guess, historical sensibilities. but like, but but I think I like we've been getting a lot of the terms being thrown around, and I just didn't really find that a lot of us were studying what we now are calling the right, even though as we kind of make point of it in the episodes, the Klan doesn't actually fall like cleanly on the left or the right throughout history. It will today, but I'm saying in terms of when you study it in its different iterations, it wouldn't fall cleanly like as a right wing kind of movement in all cases and times. Like there's, Russell pointed out there's progressivism, there's even feminism, there's different expressions of it in different times. Um, so that was more complicated. But I guess it's just also I was like, well, if we're saying we're in this period where the right is on the rise and white supremacy is totally sacked the government and fascism is here, then just on one level, it was like, well, we need to do more studying of that quote unquote side. And then there's sometimes in our podcast spaces a lot of hand wringing about liberals, which I totally understand because they can be very annoying. But there's so much of that there doesn't really seem to be any other thing. And then I think even more, I guess, pointedly, like there also seemed to be this odd embrace of these groups as allies in some cases, particularly when you're talking about in relationship to Palestine or something, because they might have something critical to say about Israel. When if you know their history, their reasons for hating Israel or disliking or even opposing the project of Israel has really nothing to do with why maybe we would oppose the project of Zionism, right? So, but because there was this, that's why we just did America First, was some of that too. Like there's this odd kind of shoehorning where it's like, well, they don't like it either, so maybe we can unify. And I was just kind of like, people aren't really. I don't think people have enough clarity on the politics of what they're really saying they think they can work with. Like this is a kind of a joke. So it's important to like, okay, let's really study, because it's like by studying the Klan, you get into history in general. So you're not just studying the Klan, you're getting into the different politics of a time period, right? So you get to learn more about where was the United States around the time of the Civil War and Reconstruction, in the second wave. You getting into this industrial era where capital is able to mass produce products on a scale it wasn't able to mass produce. So we get into things like skilled labor and unskilled labor and all those different debates. When you get into the third wave, you're dealing with folks coming out of World War II and even and then you're also dealing with the civil rights movement. You're dealing with how there was these different expressions in the South about how to oppose the civil rights movement, and how we didn't necessarily maybe discuss this as much, but how like the Klan and that kind of like overt violence was only one expression. Like sometimes the segregationists and the Klan were not always on the same page, and I think people kind of just merged them together. Sometimes the segregationists believed in more of a law and order approach that would sometimes play footsies with these folks because they needed that violence to advance their order. But sometimes that violence brought, as we dealt with in the third episode, too much. It pushed people against your side. Like like when now you're moving people more to the side of the civil rights movement. So it also showed how like this kind of unified whiteness has not really ever been true throughout history. So like just looking at history, it can teach us a lot about all these questions that people are raising today. We really don't get a lot into Trump and all of that, but I think it can inform that, because you see like these things are just not as clean as we may want them to be right now. There's a lot of different tendencies and a lot of different coalitions that have come and gone, and today's coalition will come and go too. It's not a static thing. There's been moments where it looked dark and it got better. There's been moments where it was opposite. But I just think, for me, yes, we do myths about Black people, but we would say in related too. So it's not just about studying the Black condition. It's about also understanding your supposed enemy and understanding things from the perspective of them. And that's something that Ross always talks about is we have to understand things from the perspective of the people who say they want to kill you. You should probably study the people who say they want to kill you. But you should understand how do the people who want to kill you see it. And often our stuff, it focuses on the victim's perspective, which has merit, but it's often like Black folks have been put in this corner where we're mainly supposed to talk about things from the perspective of our victimhood and how we can overcome the victimhood. But how do the people who put us in the corner understand it, right? How do the people who want to kill us understand themselves? And how do they understand themselves in relationship to maybe other forms of power as well? So from our standpoint, when you are victimized, it's understandable and natural to put all those people in the same group because you're trying to survive. So I'm not knocking people that do that. You don't care if it's a Nazi or a Klansman, if someone's about to lynch you. This is not really an important question, right? Like you just don't want to be lynched. So you don't make the distinction. But if you are trying to like really deal with that element on an organized way, you do need to understand the difference, in my opinion, between a Nazi and a Klansman. You do need to understand the difference between a conservative Republican and a full-fledged evangelical. Like you do need to understand, even when these groups work together, we need to understand like what are the tendencies, because that's how you even defeat things, is you exploit the differences amongst the groups to even like create wedges and stuff anyway, right? So like, but we're not often taught to study it from that 30,000 foot view, from the view of how these people and how these groups, how these ideologies operate, not just how they impact us, but how do they see the world, and how do they want to, what is the systems and what is the, not the systems, what are the objectives and goals that they want to enact, and how do those things influence, the world we live in. Like that's more what we're interested in, not just talking about the violence for the sake of the violence. Like most of the episodes, we deal with the violence, but that's not our main focus because everyone talks about the violence. Everybody wants to talk about the lynching. Everybody wants to talk about the church bombing. We note all that, but what leads to the church bombing? What motivates that? That's more so what we're interested in, I think, as researchers or scholars, in trying to understand that. So that's what leads us to maybe problematize some things, like to Russell's point, that are just the top 40 kind of sayings. Like we're trying to problematize the top 40 a little bit. Even if y'all don't agree with this, it's fine. But it's just like, maybe there are other songs here, maybe there are other records to listen to. And the top 40 is always going to say white supremacy, fascism, far right, liberal, whatever. Like it's going to be all those terms. And maybe you still would ultimately turn that on at the end of the day. But it's like there are other ways to maybe consider it beyond the top 40.
I think, also, and it was embedded in something you mentioned earlier in your point to Black is, is there a way in which we can just for a moment be serious people? And so if we mention fascism, how can we then jump from that and then look up the show times for centers? I don't understand that. If we understand, the historical context of the term fascism, what has occurred under that ideology, it should bring us pause or help us tell us to move around the world a little bit differently. Preparing for these, I had to go back and reread the Turner Diaries.
Me too.
That day that I read the Turner Diaries, I didn't go out, because it's just like, it makes you think about certain things, and that to me is more normal and more serious treatment of what we're saying is serious, because people are saying that fascism is serious, but yet our actions don't reflect that, because look what we have spent more time with, discussing since, the more sort of use of fascism. I mean, right now, the during this time of our recording, the biggest conversation point is around a documentary, that, we can sort of debate the quality of how well it's done, but it's a documentary around, a hip hop mogul, put on by somebody else who doesn't care for the hip hop mogul, you know, and so we have more conversation around that, as opposed to something that we say is quite concerning and something that could mean the loss of our lives. Um, I'm not saying we can't hold, entertainment and other things, but the point that I guess I'm making is that it seems to be we don't have two hands, and we're not holding two things. We seem to always only want to hold one thing, and it's always the same thing. So I just wanted to kind of add that additional point.
No, appreciate it. I mean, I was really honored when you all approached me about doing this, and also like um kind of excited, because I think it's for all the reasons that you all have laid out. I mean, it's not something that is discussed enough. Um One of my good friends and comrades, Brooke, just talks about just the paucity, the lack of discussion of white people. And, he works in abolitionist spaces and, organizing around local jails and, the Bay Area and stuff like that. And, even in a lot of ways, like we have a huge body of research around prisons now, right? And
Yeah.
like so little of that is dedicated to how many white people are going in and out of these prisons, and then their experience, and then the
Yeah,
political formations that exist for that
yeah, just
inside.
the collateral damage, basically. Yeah,
And I'm not gonna sit here and say like it's the most important thing, or that we know the disparities and the discriminatory treatment of other groups, but at the same time, you're still talking about like probably 1 million people like that are in there. You know what I'm saying? Like in terms of the population of people who are incarcerated, and that's also a very interesting thing too. And I mean, there's all kinds of ways that we could talk about that. It's really a separate conversation, but other scholars have done some work around this, talk about, like Kelly Little Hernandez and others, to talk about like um the way hobos are treated historically, right? And then this becomes like the criminalization of homelessness or loitering or like idleness and all of these things, right? Actually, which come out of a very kind of capitalist, and enclosure based, paradigms, right? Of how to deal with people who aren't actually functioning within the capitalist system the way that they are supposed to, right? So that's one element of it, right? But it still doesn't explain all of it, right? And so there's just like there's a lot to be able to like dig into there. But just broadly,
just not just the white people on the prison point, not just the white people who are in prison, but also the guards. I mean, people who are familiar with my work know working with
mhm,
Pendleton too. We're talking about again a group of people that the Pendleton two had a fight who were in a group that identified themselves in the Klan, the Sons of Light, right? Like that's. But there's not really a lot of research on like guards. You might hear a little bit about like white supremacist groups in terms of prisoners, but they're like guard gangs. There's not a lot on that either. Just want to make that point. There's some good work. Like I know of one particular on the Brotherhood here in Indiana, but there's not a lot of good work on that and how deeply that runs. Because that's where in these lows we talking about these waves. In these lows where these waves are not very high, this is where a lot of this activity goes. Is actually in the prisons.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and Jared, I mean, I think you need to continue to sort of explain your particular point, because I think it touches on a myth, which is white people don't have a grievance, right? And so the fact of the matter is, especially if we believe, the words that the organized white power indicates, especially through the 14 words, they are, reacting to their lived experience. People are being arrested. People are being harassed by police. And serving time. People are surveilled. People are losing jobs. People are overexposed to unclean water or polluted air, or being forced to move, forced evictions. And while some, people who experience those things, they move to, maybe some concepts of, communist thinking, maybe socialist thinking, maybe anarchist thinking, because they wish to somehow still live in cooperation with other people who are like people who are experiencing that are not white. But others, ultimately become vulnerable because, especially if we think about the geography of the United States, there are just places that who else is present to provide another perspective. Kansas is massive and empty. And I'm sure there's not sort of somebody present to provide, some insight on Ruth Wilson Gilmore or something like that in a state of Kansas, right? So I just wanted, I hope you kind of continue your particular point. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's right. And I think one of the things too, like another myth, right, that I hear sometimes, and I understand where it comes from, right, is this idea that uh that white people are already organized, like that the average everyday white
Yeah,
person
yeah,
is
yeah.
like a part of, you know, that because the white supremacy benefits white people, this is how the argumentation would sort of go, right? Because white supremacy benefits white people, like they are already organized and doing politics and, doing all these things. And like for sure, there are white people, wealthy white people mostly, right, who are running these communities. And I have seen that up close and personal, growing up and everything else. But growing up in a space like I grew up in Southern Oregon, right, which is not, I mean, it's different from Indiana, but it's similar in a lot of ways too. Um, you know, if if I had been looking for an organization in that, age or like it would have been much easier for me to find, the local Aryan Nation or the Three Percenters or, any number of organized white groups, but who were engaged in some form of white supremacists, white nationalists, separatists, form of politics, right? Um, but other than anarchists, right? And kind of like this is where actually, one of the things I do want to say in this conversation is that the one group that I've known of for years that do some level of analysis around this are anarchists, right?
No,
Red
that's fair.
anarchists mainly, who often were confronting these people within like the punk and hardcore and like metal scenes and stuff like that. And were having to battle with them essentially over like contested spaces, right? Because skinheads or different groups were actually trying to co-opt or take over these spaces as spaces that they could organize and infuse their politics into, right? And you would have certain people who are, because punk has had also, a lot of anarchistic kind of trends within it. Um, People who are more aligned with that kind of politics would be like, We have to defend this space, right?" And the question of violence was always there, and so that's also where you get actually a lot of what I don't even know if we can say on the air anymore, anti-fascism, but but this Antifa or the anti-fascist politics, at least the more like, that's actually using that term is kind of, like, newer within, US politics, but a lot of those tendencies come out of, like, kind of an anti-racist, anarchistic organizing within, like, punk spheres and stuff like that, and those groups actually, it would often be in zines, and there are a few books that are out there and stuff like that, but they actually would take the time, in some cases to like really try to learn like what do these different groups want, and is actually them too in different moments. Like I haven't deeply studied the World Trade Organization, that moment, the anti-globalization, protests and all that. But in that, there were certain groups who were like, hey, we could actually align with these, far right groups because they're opposed to the US state and they're opposed to globalization. And it was actually groups of the anarchistic folks within that who are like, no, we can't do that, like, because these people want to actually kill us, like, but and I think that's like, I guess where I would leave it for now too, in terms of, let's see, I think I wrote down a couple other things, but you know, you can't underestimate the relationship of these groups to violence, right? I think that's a really important thing. And this becomes a little bit of a point of separation, I think, because it is not true that like every, garden variety white person like has a capacity or an intention around enacting violence around anyone else, right? But there are groups of people who are, and it's not like, I one of the things you all talked about in your episodes is like, just trying to think about these things through a psychological lens is inadequate, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you have to also understand that, like, I mean, one, the violence often can come through, it comes through training, right? Again, this is organization for the capacity to enact violence for political ends, right? And so even as Rasul, I know you've talked about too, like the pedagogical purposes of this for them, right? And I think that's the thing too of when groups, you mentioned to Black, like the idea of, for instance, pro-Palestine folks talking about some figures that are within the kind of media sphere associated with some of these groups. It's like you can't underestimate because they don't it's also not, they enact violence over different groups in different time periods based on the politics and what they're doing in that period. But like a good example, if we go back, Tariq Khan talks about this a lot in his book, The Republic Shall Be Kept Clean, that if we look at that first wave Klan and like that kind of the post Reconstruction era, and then into like the 1880s, 1890s, right? The phases in there. One, as you all said, like it's not the Klan that's there's a lot of different groups that are doing
yeah. By
lynchings and
that
things
point, the
like.
Klan wasn't even relevant. Yeah,
Right, but the groups that are doing lynching, yes, they are lynching Black folks, right? And so that, like, we need to name that. But also, they're going after Italians. They're going after, Jews. They're going after, communists and anarchists,
yeah,
right? And then they're going after indigenous people as well, right? And so, like, and if we think about it in a more modern sphere, some different groups on the right, say the Proud Boys or whatever, who have a capacity for violence, like they might be targeting trans people or queer people, or and so that's the other thing of this too, is not flattening it out and thinking that you know what we think of as a white supremacist group, that they only have, or a white nationalist group, right? That they're You have to actually study them, right? And have to actually understand where they're going with their politics in a specific period to really be able to also anticipate the kinds of things that they're
yeah,
going to do too. And it's volatile too, right? So like any type of aligning with these people is very dangerous, right? Not just for you personally, but also for a lot of other groups of people. And I think that's important to understand. It's also something that you can't homogenize and say it's all one thing.
No, no. And I was just gonna say, I mentioned the 14 words, and so I mean, just because there's 10 hours to ask people to go back to
yeah.
to
You should
find the
say,
14 words, but
yeah, say the
they're written down by David Lane, who spent some time as a Klan member, but spent the bulk of his time as a neo-Nazi. And as we must secure the existence of our people and the future for white children. Again, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. And we can't take that for granted. What it's saying, like, it's not a cover for like, well, we actually really hate people. That's our, hate Black people. That's our real slogan. Like, no, this is an intentional message that they were saying to themselves, because the 14 words wasn't really about us knowing anything about this. This was something to sort of shape and guide, and it has taken on a form of itself, in which people have created organizations based upon just this slogan. They've got into heated arguments with each other based upon this slogan, who is doing this more or doing it better, or who's falling behind in sort of maintaining this. So it's a very simplistic sort of phrasing that's meant to be able is meant to translate and be understood by all types of levels of people, whether it's, you know, middle class, lower class, working class, you know, GED, you know, PhD. It's you know, it's tangible in that way, and it's all focused on, you know, creating a society for them. And it's an interesting the note that they're clearly are indicating that other white people who are more in power are not doing this, are not, you know, are not following through with this. So again, I just want to make sure that for the record, people know what the 14 words are, and sort of can, you know, can hear it for that respect.
The other thing on like things not falling neatly with that right left, you know, is that that is still true, right? Like, and so I think that that's the thing is it's part of why also, um, you know, some of these groups are still effective at, you know, at co-opting, right? Or at convincing people, right? That like it's, I think it's one of those things too that always bothers me less even with the Palestinian thing than you know, when people on the left think that they can unite with some of these groups around certain things and like, oh well, we can pull some of those right-leaning viewers over to our platform. And I mean maybe you can, right? Because I will say like, you know, growing up where I grew up, I knew people who watch Fox News or whatever, and it didn't mean that you couldn't still appeal to them as human beings, right? Which is also, I think, another kind of myth
I
that people
think
have sometimes.
I think that's the difference though. It's like I don't it's not my job. I'm not gonna go talk to them folks, but I'm saying but I think it's one thing to think you can appeal to an ignorant white person, quote unquote. It's another thing to think you can appeal to a Nazi. like, like those are very different things. And I think
Or even more, that you can appeal to David Lane,
yeah.
you know, because so there's these levels, and, you know, Catherine Ballou, you know, in particular, but some other scholars have begun to sort of, you know, represent this visually, and, you know, so that people can have a better frame. Um, and especially nowadays, we think that it's still about numbers, and for them, it's not about numbers. And so in one of the, you know, Captain Blue's, you know, lectures, she talks about like,
And real quick, Kathleen Ballou wrote what book just so people
yeah, Kathleen Ballou writes the book "Bring the War Home," which provides a theory on its war and the environment of war that increases the numbers of recruits and the intensity of activity amongst what she calls organized white power, which is a helpful term to also think about, you know, always using or framing. She starts with Vietnam up to the present day. One, wartime brings, you know, people's skills and training into picture, because people go, you know, because they're enlisted, especially because of the class of who they are. They're going to typically go this route because also financially it comes out to be something better to go leave your small town, go do a tour, and then come back. um, you know, so so Captain Blue presents that sort of theory, you know, and is a helpful one. So within that sort of continued development of her ideas, which I'm sure she's going to bring into her next book, is that, you know, she comes up with this target image where in the middle there's this core group of 25,000 people, let's say, as an estimate, that are the core, the true believers, the people who are producing the literature, they're conducting the lectures, you know, they're the ones that organize maybe a group within a particular city, you know. So this is that small group. And I'm not sure, I can't remember if she's framing the 25,000 as just United States or worldwide. But the point,
I believe it was just United States. Yeah.
and so but that's a small number. If it's the United States, it's even smaller, of course, if it's the entire world. Because one, I think sometimes we also don't realize the United States population, it's 350 odd million people, the vast bulk of it, which is white. So 25,000 white people who are in organized by power out of 200 million, is not, significant in any regard. So 25,000 core. Then another group is around that who are the active frontline members. They're the ones that are at the protests, chanting, buying the paraphernalia, especially in the second clan. We talked about how it's a, pyramid scheme, which probably hasn't stopped, right?
Yeah.
And so that, so estimate of about 125, 150,000 to about 175,000 or 200,000 people are in that sort of second sort of target range that are around those people. And those are the people that some people think that they can flip, and maybe in some cases they can flip, but there's never the 25,000, right? That's rare, right? But they're not, that mass number is not the people who are producing the literature. They're not the mindset or the intelligence around this that's developing it, expanding it. The reason why there's so many more organizations that people can be involved with. And then there's another group around those frontline people of about 500,000 that are also consuming it, but they just choose not to be engaged in organized white power. So
They're like Christians that go to church sometimes.
yeah, and so they download a video, they view it, they hit like, they subscribe, these types of things.
But they not shooting nobody.
No. And so if those are the three targets that we can clearly mark, that still also leaves then out all these other people, which I know which is part of what we're talking about, which is how does this then diffuse out even further? These three targets are, these three sort of levels are just the people who directly are associated with the ideology as strongly as possible. People who produce the ideology, people who are trying to follow it to varying degrees, and people who read it. Everybody else is completely oblivious to how they're assuming it, appropriating this, where the groups are meeting and why they're meeting, and that type of thing. And so if we sort of think about that sort of, provides a way to sort of understand of who and who. And so exactly, you're not flipping, I mean, the fact that Don Black is the creator of Stormfront. His son, disavows his father in Stormfront. That's rare. We don't hear about anybody else, right?
Yeah, and it's rare, and it's not really, again, it's the distinctions like you just made. So and I've said this, I remember I was on Rev Left and I said this to I was just like, I never see this kind of recruitment enthusiasm for like the Bloods and the Crips or something. Who are probably much more flippable than, than the Aryan nation. But so I never see this kind of recruitment enthusiasm. Like, we need to get, again, you'll see it from like black radical spaces, maybe not as much you're used to, but you used to see this kind of like, it's sometimes maybe an obsession with the lumpen. But outside of that, you are not going to listen to a lot of these social democrat shows and talk about the black working class that is vulnerable to gangs and how we need to bring them over to communism or socialism. You never hear this. So and I think there is an inherent racism or at least racial bias in that, because you never really hear that about like any other group of people who are vulnerable to like organizations that might lead them down some dark paths. You just never hear it. It's only people who are vulnerable to white supremacy in this kind of narrow view. And then to Rasul's point, a lot of folks that are saying this don't even really have an understanding of what they're talking about. They think like even when we say Fox News definitely trumpets some of these talking points, no doubt. But Fox News is not Stormfront, you know. And I'm saying that's where I think people kind of just throw it all together. And I even say, even just going through this process, this helped me even be more clear about that, even just doing these episodes, because I'm guilty of doing that too. So I'm not here to like stand above anybody on that. It's just like when you really read this shit, you're like, oh, this is a little different than just like some Fox News, Newsmax kind of, it's like this is another level than just, Republicans bitching about welfare queens or something. Like, again, there's definitely a pipeline within that stuff, but I'm just saying it ain't it ain't exactly the same. And a lot of folks will call that stuff Nazism or whatever because they don't read, like I posted the order and what their declaration of war says, which is a much more open, like position on how they feel about the world. Um, so I definitely think the political right definitely like takes from that shit. I'm not saying that they have no connection with it, but it's not the exact same thing when you actually read it, because they know if they went out here and said that explicitly, no filter, like it's not even going to appeal to some of their folks. Or in some cases, you find, and I think you're seeing that today, is that they realize, oh, some people are hungry for that. Even if they didn't realize it. So we are going to push more of we're going to lean more into it than we may be used to, because some of our base is hungry for that kind of rhetoric. But still, to Rasul's point, they're not those people, even if they're hungry for the rhetoric, are not joining that 25,000 group. They're not really serious in that sense, but they might enjoy just hearing jokes about it, or even hearing kind of like dog whistles to a kind of white preservation or whatever, but they not really about that life like that. Just like we were saying, we need to be more serious. It's not that all white people are serious either. I think that's another thing about like white people are serious and organized, and we're all out here watching movies and smoking weed while they, like that's not, that's basically just a Black Radical Cosby kind of talking point. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's the main thing just from my perspective on it is that when you think about um that for the most part the white community, whatever that means, right? I mean, like Stefano Harney I think once said on our show that there is no white community. Whiteness is the absence of community, right? And but I think that you know, growing up in a area, right, where it's mostly white people when I was growing up there, um, there just wasn't much organization at all, right? Like not many unions, not many there were churches. Like churches was probably the most organized that most white folks were, right? If you went to a certain church, there was a political kind of orientation to that and a kind of in circle with that. And politics is taught in those spaces, right? But outside of that, you know, I mean, I did know of neo-Nazi groups. I did know. I mean, the the three percenters in particular. I mean, because there are areas in Oregon. I mean, people probably know of stuff like this from like, you know, the Bundy family and some of this stuff. But like, there's an area not far from me in Oregon where you had people who had seized land from the federal government, and it wasn't a deep like I'm as far as I know, they still are there. Like this is not something along the lines of like, there was an armed confrontation and that sort of thing. It's like, no, a whole group of them that are armed went up there to live, and nobody wants to go in and fuck with them because they know if they did that there would be a problem, right? And so then when there are like protests, right? Like BLM protests or pride related stuff or whatever, like these groups will come out, to make their presence known around some of these things, often armed.
Well, I mean, you're not
No.
far from Idaho, which, they literally hold a Aryan World Congress. Like that was where they used to hold that. So people around the country would all come and converge to have the Aryan World Congress in Idaho, so it's right up there. Yeah.
And besides, anarchists, that have been good over I would say the past 20 years, maybe 25 years in writing about this, right? Southern Poverty Law Center has to also be acknowledged as probably one of the few places since the 80s that has been sort of trying to be a hub for this, whether they get it right or wrong. The point is, at least there's something present there. And so they've always produced a hate map. And so I'm sure we can sort of provide this to the notes to the listeners. But when you look at the hate map, you can geographically get a sense of what you're mentioning or talking about, Jared, because you can sort of see that while there are major clusters in big cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, there are also a lot of, smaller clusterings in the middle of different states, especially some of these states that aren't as populous, and and that's hugely important to sort of recognize in the sense that they may corner the entire market for people to evolve in their political thinking. Hey, I'm working at Amazon in Montana and I'm sick of my wages, and my supervisor, um, and also my coworkers, and all my coworkers may be indigenous or Latinx or something like that. Who's present to process my anger? you know and I don't go to church, which a lot of people don't, right? I mean, regardless of what people want to believe, a lot of people do not, right? And so who ends up being there, especially if you have a coworker who's involved, they can sort of just suggest like, hey, I hear you, brother, that you have
Hey,
this
check this out. I got this app.
exactly. Here's this link, and they may, I mean, they may listen and they may disagree with current points. Like, I don't want to hit nobody. I don't want to beat nobody up, but like, but I also agree with this particular point. And so then they come back and listen to some more. And so exactly, when you look at this entire map, you can see also where, organizers have abandoned in terms of thinking about addressing people's needs, and we know specifically the Democratic Party long since abandoned its 50 state initiative, that Howard Dean, which some people may not even remember, was really the sort of key sort of architect of, and once he sort of was kicked off, the sort of circuit or part of the representation of the brand of a Democrat, they went to the social media part, which then went to a whole nother class of people and also within urban centers.
Another thing we can thank Obama for.
Exactly. And so completely abandoning addressing local issues, which is what Howard Dean was trying to push with the 50 state initiative, is you need to have an office in Boise, but not just in Boise, but in the small towns outside of Boise, Idaho. And they shuttered all the 50 state initiative, which then meant there was not a place then for somebody to maybe get involved in a campaign call against, a toxic dump, or whatever else. So yeah, I just want to kind of, sort of present that to people. But again, look at the show notes for the link to it and just take a look at it, because you can hover in on each of the circles and sort of see which actual organization too is in the area, which also says a lot, because people choose organizations based upon their ideology. And in this period of time of the 80s and 90s, you start seeing people no longer being so, set in their ways of just being a Klan member. You start seeing people come in and out of organizations based upon their own evolution. They leave the Klan and go to neo-Nazis. They leave neo-Nazis and create their own organization. Sometimes that's because of their political evolution, but sometimes it's also because people just move. And then so in one city, the skinheads are dominant, and in another city, the order is more dominant. In another city, the base is more dominant. In another city, the white Aryan resistance is more dominant. And so that's
which is just true. Again, putting aside the morality for a second, that's just true with any political tendency, any organizational like kind of network. So we could say that even about like,
and people date people,
yeah.
people go out, people get new friends, people, people may start dating somebody, and I'm mentioning dating because it's not far-fetched, because also I think one of the myths is to think that this is all male. And this
And
is
that's
and
another thing that
that's
Kathleen,
farther from the
yeah,
truth.
sure.
You have some of these organizations in there, so the local chapter that's dominated by women, especially when you start getting into some of the places in which music is the way in which the ideology is sort of promoted through punk and so forth. And so you have a punk band with a woman front. That's a front lead singer that all of a sudden becomes very attractive to the listeners, present. And so there's so many different ways in which people come in and out, both strongly because of their political sort of pursuit of knowledge, and sometimes it's just haphazard because it's a part of how people socially move from one place to another, and they pick up on things based upon who they run with.
Something we did, I only mentioned the 3 episodes because there was another episode, and this is kind of a revisiting of that episode because I felt like we needed to flesh it out more. But we had another one called the myth was white unity equals, or white supremacy equals white unity. And there were some things that Rasul raised that I even myself had to think through a little bit more. And we alluded to it at the beginning, but it's this usage of the term white supremacy to define, I'm going to just say loosely define any kind of white domination, all right, like in any form. So from the most like interpersonal way to the state to including the groups that we've discussed, white supremacy has evolved as a term to define all of that. um but I did a little digging. I can't say I did it at full exhaustive digging, so there might be some holes, but I did a little digging just to see when that really occurred. And there's really not much, like any of the scholars that we all like to quote. If we're talking about Fanon, we're talking about Huey P. Newton, if we're talking about organizers or activists like Malcolm X, if we're talking about King, if we're talking about Ella Baker, there's not really, I looked up the work of these various scholars and others, and there's not a lot of references to naming everything white supremacy. Like that's not really a common thing that was done in those eras. And you can even go further back. You're not even going to find like Frederick Douglass saying that, which probably he would have had more merit in some ways than we do today. So it really emerges. I think the closest thing I found, again, this is not an exhaustive study because I didn't have time to really get in the depths of everybody. But the closest I think I found was in Wretched of the Earth. Fanon talks about the supremacy of white values. That it's in the concerning violence chapter. That's the closest thing I found. Now, folks will refer to white supremacy, but it is usually to discuss the Klan or the Klan was the main thing in like the 60s and 50s and 60s. Is to discuss like hate. They'll call them hate groups. Dr. King and Stride Towards Freedom, I think, talks about the South being divided into the white South being divided in these different clusters. Not even just the white South. I think he just says the South in general, but he divides them into these different clusters. So he says there's the white supremacist groups like the Klan and such that enact this vigilante violence. Then there's just the segregationist South, basically. Then there's a small white minority that actually might want to fight for justice. Then there's a lot of just complacent people, as he was very hard on, that don't want to do anything. You know, so even for him, that's not how he saw the South, as just this kind of bastion of white supremacy. Now, people can still push back and say, well, just because they didn't have that analysis doesn't mean that it's not relevant here. And I'm not even suggesting that in some cases it's not. That's why I really try to wrestle with this. But nonetheless, like before the 80s, there's just not a lot of prominent scholarship. And honestly, in the 80s is when it starts. We really don't see white supremacy being thrown around as a mainstream kind of academic term in terms of stuff that gets outside of the academy. When Twitter and just online stuff arises until like 2010s. I think one of the scholars that helped popularize it the most was Ta-Nehisi Coates. When you go back and read a lot of his work, he uses white supremacy a lot. And me and Rasul, believe it or not, don't actually hate Coates as much as people do. Like a lot of people don't like Coates. I don't really hate him. That I don't really have a hardcore like beef for Coates. But I'm just saying, just looking at it factually, he was one of the ones who really gives rise to it. Now, when I was first introduced to it, it was in Black Agenda Report. They used it more broadly. So I'm saying it's been used in different spaces. There's philosophers like Charles W. Mills wrote a piece like white supremacy from a philosophical perspective, and he tries to make a case to see it as a unifying system. And there's different scholars. Even if you go to Wikipedia, it's funny, they have like two different sections. If you just do the white supremacy page, you can look at it anytime. And they have a section that talks about everything we've mainly discussed, like a Nordicist view, like white people coming from the Nordic area and that being the highest form, and the Aryan view. And they talk about these different white supremacist groups. They just name them all, and that being white supremacy. Then there's a whole separate paragraph where they say in academia, white supremacy is also used as this kind of unifying theory of like white privilege and benefits and such. And often the two don't really meet. And that's where I found there to be some real issues. Like the people who write about white supremacy as white privilege and as like just kind of attitudes and things of that nature don't really have a lot to say about anything that we've discussed for the last nearly hour and a half. They don't really have a lot of scholarship, if at all. And this is something Rasul pointed out. I looked it up, and you were proven correctly. There's really not a lot to say. If they do have anything to say, it's kind of like those groups are sideshows or whatever, but they don't really have much to say about the violence and the organization of those groups. So it's interesting how these terms divulge. So I'm just again, since we're having more of a discussion, I'm not asking direct questions. I'm just kind of leading us into that section of how we are to deal with that. I mean, Rasul, you're the one that kind of first made this point. Because admittedly, I never really I always found a certain kind of uncomfortable with calling anything and everything white supremacy, but I just never it didn't really seem to be that deep. Now I have different ways of thinking about it. I'm just curious if you want to speak more on that, and then we can just go around the table on it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, part of it, in developing into sort of pushing for differentiation or distinction is really a byproduct of just trying to be a good teacher to students. You know what I mean? So if I'm teaching a class on these specific topics, I'm not teaching something else and just randomly just throwing in something about the Klan. But I mean, I'm literally teaching a class on, like, let's say lynching or something to that effect. Or one time I was teaching a class that was on just the history of social movements. Um, you know, teaching it over and over again and trying to answer people's questions, forces a need to create distinctions so that people can understand and not conflate things or use things synonymously, out of nowhere. And so that's when I really started to understand that, if we, white supremacy is a term that we can now retroactively sort of assign and categorize things that happened before it started to emerge as a term to be used in the, let's say, the late 70s, 80s. Technically, we have to think about it then as an ideology. And so there's all these different ideologies that are technically white supremacy, even though they didn't call them that when they first arose, whether it's Anglo-Saxonism, which, I think we talked about in maybe the first or second episode. That's a clear-cut thing that was for upper class, white populations. We're talking, the late 1700s, 1780s, 1790s, and early 1800s, while, as they were trying to not really be a distinction against Black people, but the wave of immigrants that were coming in, first German immigrants that were troublesome, and then Irish, then Italian. They were trying to establish a distinction. And then, of course, once they start procuring the territories in the later half of the 1800s, like 1890s, from Spain after the Spanish American War, then it's literally used as a term in the law. This is why these territories will never become states, is because they're alien races that don't understand our Anglo-Saxon principles. So that's an ideology. Eugenics is an ideology. These are not just haphazard things. And so when you start thinking about them as ideology, white supremacy is just a term that's useful to place them all under, but it can't be used as some blanket thing that somehow the minute Jared is born, he's being schooled by one of his parents, whispering in his ear. His first words were white supremacy. Like that's that's not, and every white child is experiencing this. White. Remember, you're white. And like as if that's what's happening. No, it has to be articulated, created by an entity, an organization. It has to be educated to its membership. And again, going back to Captain Blue's point of organized white power, it just forces you to think about these things in that way. So it's not just in the air somehow, and it's just sort of somehow casually getting to people. So once we get into this, this era's sort of thinking, it really comes about, and I think we mentioned it in late 1960s, 67 specifically, with the creation of the book White Power. So they themselves create their own literature, and this was the first time that a white supremacist is putting their ideology in book form as philosophy. Before this, these people who are thinking of white supremacist thinking were creating books that were talking about other things, whether it's, evolution and stuff like that.
Zoology.
Yeah,
Yeah,
zoology,
yeah.
but this was the first
Like
time.
it was more like the scientific and
Yeah,
even some of the
yeah,
religious racism or religious white supremacy, but they're more trying to theorize on like people as subjects.
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you can maybe give some credit to maybe Madison Grant and the passing of the great race, before this, like,
Yeah,
and,
yeah, I was reading that. Yeah.
but and that's, going back to, near the turn.
But that was still within like zoology or something, though, right?
Exactly. So he's still talking about evolution and so on. And of course, he's not talking about any non-white race within it. He's talking about, Mediterraneans watering down the Nordic race, right?
Yeah,
Um,
the darker Europeans.
yeah.
Yeah.
So he,
Quick aside, I
yeah,
just found funny
yeah,
that his work. I remember I was going over our episodes and you talked about that work being used for national parks.
yeah,
Um,
because he was the founder. He's one of the founders of conservationism. The whole notion of preserving the redwood forests and also making them accessible for us to use. Yeah,
I found it funny. This is a quick aside, so I want you to go back to your point, but
yeah,
how we have that history that a lot of folks don't know, like even the idea of conservation. But then recently there was that the Trump administration said that they're not going to let students go into national parks
right,
free anymore on
right.
Juneteenth and MLK Day. And people will call that white supremacy and not know like how national parks were even put into effect, right? Like it's just a
Yeah,
little funny caveat, but go ahead.
yeah. Conserve the natural resources for the race. I mean, that was the whole point. But so, I mean, so yeah, you can give some maybe, credence to that particular book. But really, I think the clearest ideological book that's produced in is 1967 with White Power. And as we, also mentioned in that episode, is that it's not coincidental that it's the same year as Black Power being produced, which goes back to our point that, we act as if, white populations cannot be aggrieved and don't have grievances against their status in the United States.
Yeah, whether we vibe with it or not.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and so he puts this all in book form, and the reasons why there needs to be white power, and the reasons why white people need to come together, because they're not together. And if you read the book, that's what he's doing. He's trying to make an American Mein Kampf. That's his intent. But as we mentioned, he gets killed by one of his colleagues, before the book comes out. So he never gets to enjoy the success, much less build from the success. But the book still has its impact, because then it starts maybe other people to think about producing literature and how important producing literature is, as opposed to just walking around with robes and performing rituals. No, you need to create. You need to be you need to be an intellectual. You need to think this through. You need to produce something that other people can consume, to read and to understand, because that's how it could expand. otherwise it stays small and it stays, hokey, and it stays in this sort of like good old boy, good friends, sort of way. And so he puts this all in this form, besides doing things before this that were even a little bit more advanced as well, creating a newspaper, and these types of things. But yeah, 1967 white power is formed. And I think this is when they themselves are now thinking about white supremacy, through the articulation of this book, White Power. And so they can then expand on it, which is what they ended up doing. But you're right. We don't see white supremacy being sort of brought forward, even with the publishing of this book after 19. There's no reaction to this book. You don't see anybody speaking on it that we of note, like Fred Hampton is not speaking on it. Well, he does say white power, remember, in relationship to not, uh, you know, Lincoln Rockwell's, articulation of it, but he's talking about, the collectives of, you know, white young people who were being aggrieved in the north side of Chicago because they had moved from the South to, Chicago, and they were experiencing mass evictions or unfair treatment, on the streets by police and so forth. And they were walking around with, Confederate flags, on their lapel. Yeah, the young patriots as a form of rebellion, because they were taking the spirit of rebellion from it, even though they understood it was Confederacy. They also saw it as anti, you know, United States in some way, until, of course, Black Panthers sort of talked to them about also what that represents, and they, of course, got rid of it.
And people overplay that story.
Yeah. But you have speeches by
Yeah.
Fred Hampton that's saying, power to the people, black power to black people, white power to white people, and I mean, of course, he's clearly, again, not clearly talking about it in this Rockwell sense, but outside of that, you can't find even white power being interrogated or questioned by anybody. And so what ends up happening is we begin to sort of see this in every era, this ignoring of studying this or even talking about this. I know we just mentioned the 80s. Besides, you know, these meetings that are occurring, there's violence that's happening. And instead of talking about the violence on Phil Donahue's show or these other platforms that a lot of these Black intellectual celebrities were starting to appear on, they were using it to platform themselves. Um, but again, I mean, this starts getting to, in my age, when you start thinking about the later 80s and the early 90s, when I start going to bookstores, you don't have anything in these bookstores that are providing any information or talking about these groups in any particular way. I think you have alluded to, there's discussions about reactions to the groups, experiencing the actions of these groups, but nothing actually studying these groups in any particular way. And coming from Chicago, that's even more puzzling, because Chicago has been a hotbed of developing, neo-Nazism for quite some time. And so, there's a need, there has been a long-standing need for literature, which we've been saying over and over again. And I'm just sort of bringing in the point that there are these actual historical situations and incidents that are happening that push that point even more. And what we're also speaking to is the fact that how many times we were letting ourselves down by not studying it, you know, at all, right? There's still not even a lot of books on Oklahoma City bombing, and it'll be hard pressed if you look at the authors, find any Black authors on Oklahoma City bombing, period. And you're definitely not going to, I mean, if please tell me, and I hope people can maybe post it, please tell me a Black author about on a book about the Klan. I haven't found it, and so
Yeah.
if there is, I would love to read it, and
If it's out there, please send it. Yeah.
and I don't mean a dissertation, I don't mean a master's thesis, I mean a published book by, a Black scholar solely on the Klan. If it's so major, if it's so threatening, why wasn't this ever something that that merited study? And if it continues to be of concern, why has it not, merited study yet? Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate it. I mean, one of the things, just like anecdotally, um, I mean, when I grew up, the I always associated the term white supremacy with groups, right? With specific, neo Nazis. Mainly it was like neo Nazis, skinheads, Aryan Nation, like those, because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and those were kind of the ones that people talked about in that era, where I was, right? And I say that too because the term white supremacy, like, just for context for folks, my father was a co-editor, co-author of a book called Institutional Racism in America, which comes out in like 68 or 69, and I think 69. And he and his, like, it was, I think everybody who wrote in it was white, I believe. But it was a product of like him and other folks trying to do research actually based off of Kwame Ture's like call for study around institutional racism, as well as for white people to
Yeah,
try to address
yeah,
problems within their own community,
yeah,
right?
anti-racism, yeah.
Yeah. And so I just say that for the context of, we never, that term was like, I was in a household where talking about institutional racism or talking about, systems that held black and other people of color, non-white people, whatever term you want to use, like, that oppressed them or discriminated against them or whatever, like, this was something that we would talk about. But that term white supremacy was like reserved for something very different from the kind of institutional discussion, which is often not that, I mean, when it gets used nowadays, my feeling, I often do kind of like, I'm ashamed to say this a little bit, but like walk the other way or whatever, because a lot of times it's very liberal and it's very self-helpy at this
Yeah,
point.
yeah. It's not
When
even
it's
institutional. Yeah, like, that's
Yeah, so it's
yeah,
not, yeah, I mean, sometimes it's institutional, but sometimes it's like so effusive, and then so also like, this is what you need to do, like, white person, in order to like
yeah.
confront, you know,
It's very
basically. And
it's very HR too. Like it's got a very HR tendency to it. Like how do you spot it in the workplace? Kind of, very like sexual harassment manual kind of.
Yeah, like microaggression.
I mean, and to your point, that's irresponsible. I mean, if somebody's sitting there in one of those sessions and they think, well, if I hear something, I'm supposed to say something. And so you go to a space and there's a neo-Nazi, chanting, or a group of neo-Nazis, and you walk up on them, good luck, and we've seen that, right? We've seen
Yeah.
that happen, right? Where people are emboldened by this notion of, confront. And similar to the Death to the Klan rally, you know, you don't realize who you're confronting. You think it's about just sort of, yelling back at a person because you think that they just hate your friend, and not think that, no, they want to annihilate a race of people so that their collective can live, to varying degrees of who they may be within we were talking about in terms of the levels, right? But yeah, I just want to kind of just chime in with that particular point of like, it's irresponsible as well because we don't frame who these people are, and then also more importantly that they're organized, and what is the organized message.
Yeah, so Russell, I have a question for you in terms of how you would think about something like this, differently, or the overlap that you see, right? Because, if you study, which I know you have, like in the 19th century, right? And you were talking about conservationists and like this kind of like, there is the whole development of biological racism, right? Of like beliefs in, I mean, and you
Scientific.
go to like those those World's Fairs and stuff like that in the era, and they literally like have 14 races, right? And it goes from like this is the Anglo-Saxon race to like you Germans that, and this is actually like if people go to Epcot, like that's what Epcot is born out of. It's like when you're going around to those different, oh, like now you're in, Mexico or the, the Aztec temple, like it's born out of that old World's Fair paradigm, which actually you were supposed to be kind of moving like down a ladder of civilization essentially as you're going through that. And so obviously that's a view of, you know, whites, it's a white superiority. It's a, because always at the top of these are like specific European slices and then it kind of moves down, right, based on this. And obviously it's like conflating kind of two different things very often. I mean, it's a whole bunch of mess, but like, it has this notion that there's biological sort of superiority and inferiority as you're moving down. But then there's also, because of that inferiority, there's an inability to develop like civilization, right? Like, so like how would you, because obviously was also well organized and funded and had impacts on like imperialism, colonialism, right, to the benefit of European, particularly sort of Anglo-Saxon. I mean, it benefits capitalists, like I guess at the end of the day in a lot of ways, um but how would you situate that as distinct, or what are the important distinctions between that and when you're thinking about white supremacy, yeah.
No, I appreciate the question. So I'm gonna just, draw from, your own sort of bookshelf background. There's two books that, want to highlight in this, for our listeners, this is not planned. It just happened to be that I recognized the two books on the shelf, and one of which is Racecraft, by Fields and Fields. And, I know, one of them has passed, Karen Fields passed. And so Racecraft, they were always specific and always saying in the question about white supremacy, they always said, well, which white people are you talking about? Who's supreme? And I always was like, man, and I tried to, think about that more and more, and it dawned on me, and it makes sense because when we talk about back in the day with those World's Fairs and they had the human zoos present, you know, the white person who was paid a low wage to construct that exhibit that's going to house then some ethnic people from some particular space is not the same white person who created it and the white people who have the money to pay the admission to come to visit it. The laborer who was there building it, it was building something that wasn't meant for them, which is why, there's a grievance, right? Between some of the populations, that we would call white, because they don't see the spoils of the benefits that been derived from colonialism, and all these other particular things. They hear, that they're in control and they're like, well, when, when am I going to get my check, from the rubber in the Congo, like when, when am I going to get the money from the bananas in Guatemala? Like, I'm still buying the bananas, and I can't afford them, because the prices are going up. And so one, just acknowledge Racecraft and what the Field sisters were teasing out, even though they don't really deal with the Klan, they do sort of really challenge the notion of one, race is this sort of abstraction and only racism exists. And so part of that is also, thinking how white supremacy is also this distraction, and the ideologies that actually are Anglo-Saxonism, eugenics, are the ones that exist. And eugenics is a great example to understand the differentiation amongst white groups, because eugenics wasn't about, don't mix with black people. It was about don't mix with dumb, poor white people, period. And when they started to have eugenics testings at state fairs, they were trying to find, those are the more progressive eugenicists. They were trying to find the gems amongst the mud of poor white people. Like we need to be better people and not just look down on these people. There are some smart people among them. So let's have these testing centers at the state fair. And that was all for just that particular purpose. I mean, I think we also alluded to it in one of the episodes about how popular eugenicism was and how Jane Addams, that she was a eugenicist, and her whole thing was based upon this notion of service to these people to basically find the gems, pull them out. So I think that's one way to sort of way in which it helps me to sort of differentiate it. And then the three-way fight, is the other one where, they articulate the fact that there's these three fronts that are distinct, and sometimes they may work with each other or they happen to be working with each other. But even if they are or aren't, all three are encroaching upon the ways in which we live. And the three-way fight is, of course, the state. The second, of course, is what we now, in Ballou's term, organized white power, and, from what I remember and understand with the three-way fight, the third is the sort of the general capitalist order that's not the state, but it's sort of like everyday people who are maintaining the sort of status quo. Correct me if I'm wrong, man, but I mean,
Yeah, I think it's kind of like liberalism, if I
yeah,
remember
okay.
correctly.
And so that's the three-way, and so that also is helpful to sort of understand then this differentiation, right? And so if we think about those three spaces, neo-Nazism, the Klan, the Order, Atomwaffen division, they're all in that organized, white power space. They are not in the other two at all. Definitely not. And again, their violence is allowed by the state to happen because it's useful. It's sort of like I think of the example of I think I used in some other particular space. It's sort of like in football calling up the blitz. Fascism can be useful to call the blitz when capitalism is in crisis, right?
Yeah,
You
that's a
know,
good analogy.
but you don't use the blitz every damn play, right? Because you can get, you know,
You can
yeah,
get burned. Yeah, I mean, 'cause
burned
you
by
can not to
it.
get too deep in that metaphor, but yeah, at some point you can count the blitz too. Like you know where
Yeah,
it's coming from. It's not really a blitz anymore.
yeah, and I know we all three of us hate metaphors because sometimes people take the metaphor and then next thing you know, the whole episode is about the metaphor, and it's like, well,
Yeah, so don't keep going.
well, if we want to take down white supremacy, we need to stop the blitz, and so we need to come up with be better, better wide receivers and better quarterbacks at throwing throwing the ball, and it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, like this is not football. Like, I'm just using it as a way for us to visualize how it exists. It is not something that it wants. The state does not want organized white power just to continue to happen because they know that white power, a lot of it is anti them, and because they have their own issues with how they're running, the remaining part of society. And of course, we know with liberalism, it's the complacency of the masses of other people with no action, which kind of also alludes to Black, what you were talking about with academics. There's this sort of emergence of an academic explanation of white supremacy. And one of the things that academics have been good with has been flattening or removing violence, um,
Yep.
because that's uncomfortable. Um, we can't deal with violence, but the problem is when you don't talk about the violence or confront the violence, you then eliminate so much part of the story and so much of the actual concern. My concern with coming to work is not somebody touching my bald head. Like, what I'm saying? Like, that's disrespectful, but like, I'll live. I'm good, you know, but I cannot take being fired. And I also can't take, leaving my office here late at night and somebody picking me up, walking to my van, which is what many of these groups do, but especially did heavily during the 1980s and 1990s. There's so many incidents of shooting random black people walking down the street, because they were trying to fulfill their aims, and this person was available and easy. So I hope that kind of answers the question, but just, sort of giving, sort of support to those two readings that, again, just happen to be on your bookshelf. Again, Racecraft and the three-way fight. One, which white people are supreme, because that is not always the case. Even if some of these people who are, part of these are become the sons of light at Pendleton, they still don't run the prison, and they don't own the prison, and they don't come up with the laws to maintain and expand the prison. They just guards, and those guards can be fired, they could be moved. That's probably why they even formed a collective to protect themselves, and they can sort of lie about their, hours, amongst themselves and that type of thing. In absence of the state official who's not going to be coming to the prison to operate the prison. That's why you hire a warden, but the warden doesn't want to be there, so you leave it to the guards. And then and then, as we know from the story of Pendleton, too, the lead guard wasn't even present the day of the incident, which is why they did
Yep.
what they did,
Yep.
because the lead guard would have stopped that, because it would have created disorder, not because of some progressiveness of them.
No, he was just he just did
He was just by the book. Yeah,
he just did his job basically, like you said,
Yeah.
by the book. He was fair relative to the situation, but he wasn't gonna let them storm in and tear gas a cell and get them stabbed, right? Like that's what I'm
Right.
saying. It's not even about
Right.
yeah, it's not even about like
people want to go home. People want to go home.
like
And so the best way to go home is just have a quiet day.
I mean, even the reason we not to go too much into that, but the reason we even know about that is because the guard said it. Another guard who was involved in the uprising said it in a deposition, and if you read through the full deposition, I don't really know what's in his head, whether he likes black people or not. But there's nothing about him that reads as some kind of like a revolutionary. He's just like, man, this job sucks. Like, that's how it just comes off. This job sucks, and I didn't feel safe, and it was so he's just connecting the racism to his lack of safety. So by the racism that is put onto the prisoners, the black prisoners primarily, is firing back at him, and he's just like, this is bullshit. Like it's a long deposition. It's like 148 pages, but I'm saying that's a lot of what's in there, to your point. But yeah, it's I mean, I think I guess I'm curious on everybody's thoughts. Like, I think if I'm trying to be sympathetic to why people do draw the white supremacy and everything, because there's clearly, like we talked about even in our last episode, there's clearly there's something about society that feels for people, not even that feels, but that is like anti-black or that is racist in a sense that people carry certain attitudes. Right now, the privilege stuff got too much pumped into it and became its own cottage industry. But it is to say that like the ideas of these earlier thinkers that did establish like the scientific racism and even the religious racism, those ideas do exist like in a hegemonic sense, if you want to call them like white supremacists in a hegemonic sense, and people who are not organized necessarily around any specific ideology do carry them and sometimes even implement them through institutions and through policy and through like things that impact like bulks of people, not just interpersonally. Like people do, that does happen, right? So I think what occurred with white supremacy became, if I'm trying to give the kindest interpretation of it, it became a way to name that, like the way that this shows up, through practice, even if it's not done organizationally. So even if a job is, I would say jobs are organizations too, but I'm saying like beyond like organizing outside of the workplace, if you are only hiring people of a certain race, because it's beneficial to your bottom line, or it helps you keep your job as a manager or something. Like, people are still instituting the attitudes and the ideas that do give to a kind of that ultimately back to a kind of white supremacy, I guess, in a sense of, like, in the literal sense of the term, that white people in general are better and therefore deserve to be privileged in a certain kind of way. Again, I'm not fully endorsing it, but I guess I'm just saying, like, I guess I'm just curious everybody's thoughts on that kind of sentiment, because I do think that's what folks are trying to wrestle with to some extent. Is like, how is this happening day to day? Because when you read this stuff, they always like push these groups to the side, because they're basically saying, like, they don't have an impact on most of my day to day life. So how do I grapple with that? Like, most of the people who are over, we were talking about schools before we got online here, but most of the people that would be over uh, getting charter schools to replace public schools are probably not neo-Nazis, literally, right? And there might be some, we don't know, but I'm saying that's not really a neo-Nazi project. um, but that's still leading to, like, is eviscerating unions. It's eviscerating education for children, because you're creating a winner versus loser kind of approach to education. So just using that as an example, but I'm just saying, like, so there's a way that people are trying to describe those different types of phenomenon, and then white supremacy becomes this kind of convergence of a term that can explain all that. Again, I don't know if I really endorse that view anymore, but I'm saying, just curious, kind of, if we could just wrestle with that understanding of it.
I mean, I think you're, nice, but so
I said I'm trying to get the most gracious,
yeah.
like,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I'm criticizing all of us, right? Like, it's, when we're hungry, and we want something, unique and specific, we find all types of creative ways to search the internet for that food, and then all of a sudden, here's this that comes, and we don't know how to search to find out more information. To use an example of a progression of an ideology, or more so the watering down of one, let's think about Joe Fagan, who was phenomenal, sort of older white scholar. I think it was at Texas A&M, long since, I think, retired, but he creates the sort of articulation of systematic oppression. That's a sort of contribution to intellectual sort of discussions, amongst other things, but he frames it as systematic oppression based upon his study of, like, public housing discrimination. Um, so then after Joe Fagan, you then get Peggy McIntosh, who has probably read Joe Fagan, and Peggy McIntosh, for maybe some of your listeners, is no longer a relevant person, but Peggy McIntosh then is attempting to explain to a group of her students an understanding of what oppression is and how certain people are experiencing it more than others. And so she ultimately is, probably not intentionally responsible for white privilege, because then there was this, they basically stole her, handout that she was trying to educate her students on, and people took it like wildfire. And the thing that she developed was this, the invisible knapsack, right? So, there, we take these things out, and that's how people have less stuff, right? And it was just a tool to try to help explain something, but people all of a sudden made it seem as if you could read it and all of a sudden, be awakened. Just all of a sudden, this light shines upon you after you read the last words in the sort of handout, and people had all of these, like, bad Xerox copies of this thing, because it was passed around as if it was like secret knowledge. But she's a reader, Joe Fagan, and what she's talking about, no matter how, what her intent of what she was trying to do, was nowhere near what Joe Fagan was talking about. And then the people who were reading Peggy McIntosh then took her stuff, and amongst those readers was Robin DiAngelo. And
White
so
fragility for
and
those.
and so she develops then white fragility based upon then that. And that ultimately turns into, a push for, anti-racism, but but Robin DiAngelo's argumentation of white fragility is all about the shame and guilt that white people need to confront based upon their actions, but also the actions that have happened beforehand. That's a poor reflection of Peggy McIntosh, and an even poorer reflection of the long forgotten Joe Fagan. And so now we have people just throwing out the term anti-racism because it was made popular, and don't even know it's from, Robin DiAngelo either, right? And so anti-racism no longer even can be about stopping housing eviction, going back to Joe Fagan. It's just about watching the type of words you refer to, you know, um, letting people be heard in a meeting, not dominating a meeting. This is what it becomes. And so, but meanwhile, we have cases of people being shot and killed by police. We have people, going to jail and nobody stopping anything. Again, it goes back to, I think, to my criticism about academia flattening or removing
Taking violence
violence
out.
out. And so
Yeah.
then the immediacy, the emergency is also removed. But also the thing that everybody can sort of understand or learn to understand, because when violence happens, it takes a lot for somebody to say that lynching was justified, or the dragging of this person behind a car was justified, or what I mean, or shouldn't, or like the sister, that called the police and was killed in Springfield, that was justified. It's hard to justify that. So there's something about violence that helps with educating people, developing people's understanding about injustice, oppression, these things more concretely. But once you remove it, then it just then becomes about these notions of our mentality, what we choose to sort of believe and not believe, choose to say and not say. And so that's why I'm sort of, not pushing back, because you're not bringing it forward as your sort of
Yeah,
like,
I'm just offering it as a
yeah.
perspective that
And
I
and
know this.
and so the depth of what white power has done, organized white power has done, is not attractive for a PhD student who's going through any field to think about developing. And also they don't have advisors who's going to direct them to think about doing that. And so then it becomes a constant cycle of avoiding this subject matter while it's still happening, right? While it's still growing. And then the next thing you know, we're shocked to see a Charlottesville. We're shocked to see, something else happen.
Buffalo.
Yeah. And then
Alabama.
once the shock happens, we go back to something else.
Or now, because of the establishment of that scholarship, we start connecting these things to like other things besides the violence. So we're going to talk about podcasting, or we're going to talk about the manosphere, or we're going to talk about these things have their real issues there. But I'm saying, like, we link the violence at a at a Dollar General where someone decides to kill black folks, shoot them down in cold blood. We link that to a privileged male who's just, mad that he's not liked or something. And so we individualize it to a kind of psychological thing. But I'm saying, because of that work, it creates the feedback loop where even when that event does occur, now it just feeds back into the same existing scholarship. There's not a new consideration, right? So when that happens, I'm not like, man, maybe there's something else here besides just like some disgruntled white folks, that didn't get hugs or something. Maybe maybe there's something a little bit more I need to look into. Nah, it's just a bunch of privileged white guys, and that's that. Or Dylan Roof goes and shoots up a church, and the only thing we can talk about is how the police were nice to him, when he was arrested. And it's not that, again, it's not that that's nothing, but we immediately jump to the privilege. Like, man, if we had shot up a church and the police wouldn't treat us like that, like that's the immediate discourse after someone just went into a church, a historic church, and killed people. That's the conversation we're having, is the police wouldn't have let us live longer if we were mass murderers, so
Yeah.
it's just like a way that people reflect on these things. Is, to your point, it, even in an incident where violence directly occurs, we actually kind of go to the thing that's not violent almost immediately. We jump to the disadvantage in coverage, or something else that's not really about, like, he just went and killed, what was it, 9 people or whatever, like,
Yeah.
and it's just like, that was terrible. Or we go to the collective fatigue of the trauma of us having to watch 9 people get killed, and how it carries on, like all these other things other than the fact that the man killed 9 people. That part is not really the point, even though even though there is no other point, right? Like, it's weird how that plays out.
But I just want to kind of run through some, incidents. So from 1977 to 1988, there were 110 cases of arson, firebombing, or bombing of abortion clinics. So I'm just talking about not churches. I'm not talking about, but just abortion clinics, because that became a sort of major target point for a lot of these frontline members, not the center, not the second group, who are like frontline, troops, but the people who are just consuming it. They conducted 110 cases of arson, again, over, from 1977 to 1988. In 1984, there were 29 attacks alone just in that 1 year. Within that 1 year, on Christmas Day, there were multiple abortion clinics and doctors in Pensacola, Florida, that were part of a coordinated set of attacks, in and of themselves. Then you have, in the 1990s, the first time in which a doctor was finally sniped and killed, right? So all before this was just destroying the clinic. Then it starts to intensify. 1993, you have Dr. George Tiller, who's shot and wounded, outside his clinic in Kansas. He survived and worked the next day. But then you have Dr. David Gunn in 1993, which is part of that Pensacola, another set of Pensacola-based attacks. He was shot 3 times in his back outside of the clinic. So not at home. Somebody was camped out looking for him to come to the clinic to work. Dr. John Baird Britton and his security escort. So this time they're trying to create their own structure of protection. They're both killed. 1994, back at the Pensacola clinic. Shannon Lowney and Lynn Ann Nichols were 2 clinic employees, so not even the doctors. They were killed at 2 different clinics in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1994. Then you have, and then federally, it becomes a term, single issue terrorism. So again, other people are studying this, but we're not. So single issue terrorism, and you have a series of attacks by certain people who are maybe committing multiple. Eric Rudolph is one of the people for a course of 2 years that conducts these things, and he's he's a member, or has at least consumed the literature of some of these groups. James Kopp, 1998. Paul Jennings Hill, 1994, Scott Roeder in 2009, Michael F. Griffin, who was also with someone else, in 1993, Peter James Knight in 2001. He was one of the few that actually was not associated with any particular organization or group or consuming any type of literature. But these groups range from, Christian far-right fundamentalists, to neo-Nazis, to anti-government groups, to sovereign citizens groups, all, in and of themselves. Then you have the sort of financing of their activities in the order from 1983 and 1984 are committing a series of bank robberies. And what's alleged is that they stole somewhere around $5 to $6 million to finance, operations, and who knows how many other, bank robbery.
Didn't didn't they start with didn't they start with like porn shops or something because of some moral this is just a side note. I remember reading that like they started robbing porn shops and couldn't make enough money doing so. So they moved so they then moved to banks, but they didn't want to I think that was some kind of thing they didn't want to like they were and I'm not saying this to be cartoonish, they were aware about how they could maintain they didn't want to like I guess deflate people's belief in them. So by robbing porn shops,
Correct.
it people don't, especially in the 80s,
Yes.
that's not a.
Yeah.
It's like people already have a kind of a different, or they already gotta look down on that anyway. And who cares if you rob a porn shop?
Yeah.
They couldn't make enough money robbing porn shops, so they had to move to banks.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think we spoke to it in another episode. Larry Flint, who was the creator of Hustler magazine, is shot and killed, and not killed, but he's shot and he becomes disabled by, a leading white nationalist.
Yeah, yeah.
But even radio, so you have now these attacks that are based upon their ideology. So it's clear that they're moving not off of some feeling. This is in their line of thinking. So you have abortion clinics, like you just said, you have porn shops, you have bank robberies. Then you also start seeing the attacks upon radio hosts that are pushing up against, like, so in their radio commentary, while they're maybe playing music or shock jock or whatever else, they're also criticizing these groups. And so Alan Berg is assassinated by members of the order, he's a Jewish radio host in Denver in June 1984. And what's understood based upon the deliberations of the trial is that they were all readers of the Turner Diaries, and they were enacting what to do, from the Turner Diaries by
And
going
we've mentioned that a few times, but we got to remember millennial listeners may have not.
Yeah.
What is the Turner Diaries again for people?
Yeah. So, so the Turner Diaries are is a sort of fiction that's produced, again, literature that's produced in the early 1970s, I think 1971. Please correct me. And it's developed by William Pierce, but under the pseudonym Andrew McDonald. And it's a fictionalization of a group of people, white people specifically, that are experiencing the United States and are becoming aggrieved, and they want to begin to engage in action. So they evolve in their politics to the point of wanting to engage in armed struggle. They create cell units to then work in different sort of areas of the country.
Cell units are units that form where people do not talk with each other, like they're
right.
autonomous units,
and they operate off of a mission or a task force, and typically it's going to lead to some type of militant action with arms, not with rhetoric or propaganda, because the whole point of it is to not to be known or seen until the action is done. So they become successful by eventually growing more cells and killing enough people that they take over the United States. And so it's all within this particular fictional account, both how to build a cell, how to take care of munitions, how to create fire bombs, how to identify a target, the bonds that you need to have with people to build a cell, because these are going to be your brother and sister in arms. So it can't just be somebody who you just met off the street just yesterday, as an example. And so the Turner Diaries is this fiction, and it's been banned, but it's still highly downloaded and circulated. And so many of these actors that we know of, Timothy McVeigh and Dylan Roof, have had possession of the Turner Diaries amongst the other literature. It's not to say that everybody automatically who has the literature is going to do an action, but it is a sense that all the actors have the internal diaries, right? And so, in the Turner Diaries, they talk about who to target, and news propaganda is amongst those sort of targets. And Alan Berg, as a radio host and also being Jewish, because the Turner Diaries also identifies uh, Jews as being the sort of biggest problem, and especially because at once they take over the government, they then launch a nuke and blow up Tel Aviv, because they're sick and tired of um, you know the Zionist occupied government. The fact that Jews are running the country, and by nature of running the country, they allow Black people to flourish and Chinese people to flourish and all this type of stuff. And so instead of going after Black people, go after the real target, right? That's the kind of emphasis in mind, because we're too mindless as Black people to be a true threat. The numbers are there, but we're not going to do anything. So this is what they sort of highlight as the biggest issue. Again, I don't want to take too much time, because I know Jared wants to sort of chime in, but I just want to kind of bring back in, then emphasize our point about violence, because that's also what we were trying to cover in those past episodes. How, even though we didn't want to make the whole episode about violence, we did sort of bring that, and how important it was to sort of look into it, because like we said, in the second Klan, they did not engage in lynching because it would hurt their promulgation. So everyday people were lynching Black people under the second Klan. And then with the first Klan, we highlighted how, the wave of violence was going after, in particular, Black veterans of, the Civil War. It was an intent revenge, both to those troops that were stationed as, police of the 5 districts that, the South was broken under. One in particular sort of incident that is pretty sort of well known is the murder of Mulugeta Sarah, who was an Ethiopian student up in Seattle, November 1988, and he's killed by 3 in Portland. And so in Jared's, space, 3 white supremacists, that are affiliated with Tom Metzger's white American resistance that became white Aryan resistance. And of course, the civil lawsuit ensues, and the family won $12.5 million against Metzger and others. But this highlights like how serious, this is, and how consistently serious it has been. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, just anecdotally, like one of the first, like it's like one of my early memories. I was probably in kindergarten or first grade, and there was a karate teacher that would come to our rural elementary school, and he was a Black man, right? Which was like there weren't a lot of Black people in Southern Oregon. I mean, Oregon was founded as a white utopia, right? Like Black people couldn't own property for a long time. So like there's a lot of racist history there. I know y'all talked also on previous episodes about, Oregon and the Klan and different phases and stuff like that too. But he was jumped. I remember him recounting a story to like my mother and some other folks about him being jumped by like 5, neo-Nazis in Ashland, Oregon, right? And this would have been like 87, 88, somewhere around then, and so yeah, I mean that it was a very, like the threat was there, and it was significant enough that like I think a lot of people who grew up in that era would have stories like that, and he was, because he knew how to defend himself and everything else, like he was able to get out of the situation, with, some bumps and bruises and scars or whatever. But like, if he hadn't been, right, he could have been another person like that, was killed because, I mean, sometimes those groups, maybe they do just want to beat somebody up, but like sometimes they do want to kill people too.
Yeah, and it's just I guess even when on the violence, like what I was saying in our episodes, we talked about the violence, but again, counter to the way academia does things, the violence becomes this kind of like trauma thing just for the sake of it. Like, so it's just, you know, we've all been subjected to so much trauma throughout history, and therefore this is why I don't have to, this is why Black people behave this way. Like, and it doesn't put the violence in context as to, that's what I was saying. Like, it's from the perspective of being victimized and not understanding the people who are doing the victimizing. But I think, like, you know, like, I guess with white supremacy, it's just, I guess another point it was just, if we're thinking about the violence that's done in other, I guess in other, like, if we're talking about the police, if we're talking about imperialism, if we're talking about colonialism, if we're talking about a settler colony, if we're talking about, you know, things that are just done in the name of capital to maintain capital, you know, what that's why I said, that's why I'm flirting with the idea of just, not even flirting. I look at a lot of things through more of a hegemonic lens, particularly like the Gramscian kind of conception of it. Like, I think that's more how I understand it, not necessarily the people are driven by hardcore ideologies in all cases. But I think if white supremacy was anything, it would be more hegemonic than it would be like this guiding ideology that everyone rocks with. And I don't even know if that's, honestly, I'm still messing with it, just thinking about it. But I guess I'm just saying, like, what are we to do with, how are we to frame those other, the violence that has much more power behind it, I guess, than a white power group, the violence that does have the entire state behind it, that does have the muscle of capital behind it, that still leads to, you know, these outcomes. I know we talked about, in the last episode, Roswell, we talked about Ruthie Wilson's, Gilmore's definition of racism, and maybe that's some ways of wrestling with it. But, you know, what are the, I guess a question, or just to maybe sum up a better question, like, what are the drawbacks of calling all of that violence white supremacy versus calling it something else, or calling it maybe just more specific to what it is in a given instance?
Yeah. I'll offer a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think like one of the things is definitely, which I think we've kind of talked about throughout this conversation, is just trying to seek as much analytical precision as we can, right? So even I think sometimes if we talk about imperialism, right, like you have to actually be able to get to some kind of analysis, because imperialism, as we talk about it, you know, at least on our show, you know, we're thinking about it as an expression of monopoly capitalism, right? And so it's not just like, you know, a group of people doing a
Being
bad
mean.
thing to
Yeah,
another group
yeah,
of people,
yeah.
like because it benefits them in some kind of nebulous way. Like
Right.
there's some kind of plan in place. And that plan is based on some kind of um, political and economic objectives usually. And I'm not saying that's the case in all cases. I mean, police violence, like I think, is a is a tricky and more complex thing in some ways, right? Because you know it does pull in a lot of these different things, right? From you know, if a police officer has certain biases and they have a gun, like that freaking matters, right? Like, you know, like
Yeah.
so there are certain things that way. But then you have to think, okay, so why won't they change the laws, right, to make it harder for cops to kill people, right? And what are the barriers to that? And like that's where you get to more like in that example of, you know, capital doesn't want a disarmed or a defanged police force for when they need it, right? So there's a certain amount of that, and there's other things as well. Like I do think there's like the same kind of, you know, just like you know, y'all talked about lynching as serving a pedagogical purpose. I do think sometimes police violence is to serve a pedagogical purpose in that
Definitely.
same
Yeah.
kind of way. And like imperialism, I think, I mean, we've been reading Ali Kadri's book, The Accumulation of Wastes, recently in our study group, so it's on my mind a lot on that. But one of the things that he points to, and I think you could see this also as a connection with policing and military, right, is that we need to understand that these things are not outside of economic objectives. That it's not like um, you know, we have capitalism, right, and we work in factories and we work in stores and we do this, right, and um, oh, we're spending money on war that we could be spending on healthcare. Like, no, like the wars are serving a purpose for the people who run the country, right? And that purpose is both political and economic. And sometimes the economic is not even one of the things Kadri really talks about is it's like an investment in a lot of senses. Sometimes it's not even like that we're gonna overthrow. I mean, sometimes they'll come right out and say it, like, yeah, we want to overthrow this so we can get the oil, like, you know. Um, but beyond that kind of moment, right? It's about eliminating alternatives, right? It's about making an example out of people who try to do different things or who oppose or right. And so, like, actually, in that way, there is that kind of same pedagogical purpose on like a global scale, right? Of this is what happens when you defy, US led imperialism, or, you strike against, Israel, or, this kind of thing, right? But Kadri also talks about it in terms of like beating down the working class globally, right?
Yeah.
And understanding that a lot of the work that's like productive, that, well, he actually doesn't make that distinction because he does see all labor as productive, even socially reproductive labor. But that so much work is done in the global south, right? In terms of like actually, you know, creating things nowadays. And a lot of times what's done in the imperial core, if there's manufacturing, it's like value added, right? So it's like, they,
Refinery. Yeah.
like say it's a computer, right? In the imperial core, like we put the chrome trim on it and the logo on it, and that's our part of the process, but everything else is done other parts of that supply
Yeah.
chain, whatever.
We didn't extract it from the ground. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, he uses the example of the Congo, right? He says, like, in the Congo, you look at the last, like, 60, 70 years or whatever, and you have, like, 25 to 35 million people who have been killed, right? And, like, so that is both, and then you have Lumumba's assassination. So, like, you could think about that as, and he even goes to the level of trying to dissuade people from revolutionary ideology, right? Or trying to dissuade people from, socialism or whatever, right? And so you take this leader, right? Like, who has a more, I know Lumumba is like, he dies very young, and so a lot of his politics, we might not even know all of the places that they would have gone, right? But it's like, thinking about pan-africanism, self-determination, like all these kind of things, right? Um, and so you take that, you add that mass slaughter, industrial scale slaughter over decades, right? And then there's the extraction of all the mineral wealth, of course, which is what we talk about a lot, but there's also, like, even in terms of sort of, Kadri takes it to like modulating the amount of surplus labor, that kind of thing too, of like, um, because free time, contributes to people having the time to seek out revolutionary ideology and all these other things. But it also, at a certain level, capital has to tweak that one way or the other. Like in certain moments, they want more surplus labor, and certain moments they want less, right? So you can think about the border, like along those kind of lines too, or the policies around migration or whatever. So it's an interesting framework. I know it's broader than what we can go into here, but part of what I'm saying is like that there are so many additional things to kind of look at and analyze. And I think it'd be like, why is it okay that 25 or 35 million Congolese people have been, basically genocided over that period, right? And like, is that an expression of anti-blackness, like, or white supremacy? Like, yeah, absolutely, right? But like,
But it doesn't end there.
does that help us explain
Yeah,
what's going on in any meaningful way, right? Like, that's kind
right.
of the question, I think.
I think it goes back to that moralism that we were talking about at the beginning. That's part of why I think the project of trying to use it to explain everything fails, or at least comes up short, because particularly within the United States, there's this obsession with naming things for the sake of naming them, you know. But like you said, we are trying to understand things. To Stuart Hall, like he said, if this doesn't tell me what I can do, then I don't really give a damn about it, right? Like ultimately, we're trying to understand things to do something. Like at least that's what we should be trying to do. If we're just trying to understand things or just to name them so we could say how bad it is, then I think white supremacy does serve that sensibility. Like I could just say, because white supremacy is seen as like the worst thing, right? Like it's one of the worst things. Fascism, like it's just the worst thing. So if I can say it's the worst thing because I hate the what's happening and I don't, then yeah, I can call it that. But to understand how we actually get to 25 to 30 million people being killed, just calling it white supremacy and just walking away doesn't explain that. I mean, even we were talking about Ruthie, but that's something she even says about the term racism. Sometimes she's like, it doesn't tell me what to do. It's like, so you can tell me it's racism, but it's like, what am I supposed to do? Like, where's the material analysis that tells me what can even be done about that? You know, so it's like a white supremacy becomes a way sometimes, I think, as a term, as a broad term of just like, that's a bad thing. And, for those of us who did grow up in a time, particularly like we were talking about the 2000s off air, but like the 2000s was a time where you really weren't leaving a lot of name stuff for the most part. It was very just, I just think 2000s sucked in general, but that's a whole other conversation. but I'm just saying, like, so for people of a certain age, the ability to now have the freedom to like name things is like liberatory for them personally, because you used to just be able to, like, it was funny even reading King. I was saying like he would call things race relations, and like people don't even say shit like that anymore, like race relations. And what does that even mean, right? Like you give things these hard names, but it doesn't really equip us with the ability to do much. Even if we can call things these really like, you know, like grading terms, like it's fascism, it's white supremacy, it's, you know, even when folks use genocide, it's not that genocide is not happening, but sometimes it's just a way to just express your dismay at something. So you give it the hardest word, like the hardest thing. But but for the point of what?
Yeah. I mean, terms are meant to help us understand what maybe sometimes is not understandable. That's the whole point. And
Yeah.
and some of these people created those terms for those reasons, but we end up taking them on as if they're dogma, as something that we must now adhere to, right? So right, King is saying race relations because he's trying to explain this weird and unfortunate interaction that people have based upon race. And then next thing you have policies being developed to improve race relations, right? And that's not, well, I mean, he didn't interject that for it to be picked up.
No.
Now in the present day, we have people plenty of times creating terms because they're trying to brand themselves, in association with creating terms. And we think, and because they also think that that's what people were doing back in the day, you know, Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton came up with Black Power, not to make themselves famous, but just as an articulation of what to push for. Don't push for civil rights. We need something more. It wasn't about, okay, every time you use Black Power, you need to cite me,
Yeah, they weren't trying to become canon, which a lot of
no,
people are trying to
no,
become canon today. Yeah, yeah.
no. But I mean, I think in terms of what you asked, I mean, I think it's just one of those things where, how would I try to express it, man? It's a space in which, uh, I think the state uses capitalism to commodify or make everything a production, to make everything either a commodity or a product, right? Put through production. So everything is useful in that regards. And so fascism comes along as a sort of crisis point because, it's clear that labor has organized enough to become a significant opposition to obstruct the continuation of accumulating capital. So you need to, bring it about within that sort of, um, you know, time period. But just like fascism could be called up, so can violence. Violence becomes very useful as a regulator. And, police are just organized violence, as, Nicole Siegel, talks about through violence work. It's organized, um, in which there's a departments, there's training, and you can call it off. You can turn it on and you can call it off because they are under your sort of authority. But sometimes that's not enough because maybe the reach of the police isn't everywhere, or it's just too many people. And so vigilante violence becomes then useful to call forward. But again, just because the state through capitalism finds everything useful doesn't mean um, it was a wise decision to use it. And so there's mistakes made to allow something to grow or to manage, to fester. To think of an example, we don't have pots and pans, that cook our food that has Teflon, anymore. But there were companies that, you know, produce pots and pans and with Teflon, and people were sort of consuming the byproduct of Teflon in their food. Who knows how many of us were poisoned, by the consumption of the little bits of Teflon metal that was now in my soup. Uh, but that was a cheap resource that they saw that allowed them to cut costs, to maximize their profits until they were busted and it hurt their bottom line. And you have certain companies that went belly up or had to change operations and names. And so they no longer use Teflon, not because, they're benevolent, it's just because it was no longer profitable to maintain it. And it was
Impractical.
impractical, right?
Yeah.
And so much like the Teflon mistake, neo-Nazism, is an example of a mistake to allow to grow, because we can see over these years, so where white power is emerged from American neo-Nazis in 1967, it doesn't immediately become the order, within a couple months or even a couple years. It takes a long time, so you have, a small cohort of people who are then, you know, 5 years, 10 years later that are making some literature, and it's still not sort of being, propagated beyond that. And so then the literature is consumed by some people. Remember, that, like I said, Turner Diaries is made in the early 1970s, but it doesn't become, popular outside of diehard readers until you start getting into, the late 1980s, maybe really more so the 1990s. So again, both of us were just trying to answer your question. I think that's, to me, how I can explain or think about how sometimes there's police violence and how there's sometimes, organized white power violence, and how all of that is maybe happening in a particular space, or even why it maybe is happening. But it is still being driven by this pursuit of accumulation, um, ultimately overall. And as we were talking about, especially with the case of the Congo, it seems to be the accumulation is the best sort of explanation for, mass murdering, so many people, because it was clear that it was financing, not even really the country of Belgium, but, King Leopold and his family personally was getting wealth off of it. And it didn't really matter who died from mining it or, manufacturing it. And we see that over and over again. Like, I was just explaining to a student of mine just randomly about, bananas, Chiquita bananas in Guatemala, we have that newer book that's out, The Brothers, that, I'm still sort of reading through, and it's turned out to be pretty good as well. But to just realize at the bottom line that they did all this for the control of the money from bananas. Like, they could have just went into an agreement with Arbenz, the then president of Guatemala, on a rate, or whatever. But no, instead they completely, deposed an entire government, erected another government that then institutes a civil war over a span of, 30, 40 years, with another mass genocide in another country just for the wealth that was from bananas. And we, even if we weren't aware of it, we were aware of it because it wasn't grown here, and so we were fine with it because we kept getting cheap bananas. And we didn't ask any questions about it because we kept getting cheap bananas, and our cheap bananas are fine. I think we also alluded to in one of our episodes, it's one thing to allow the violence to happen somewhere over there, downstairs, in the other house, down the street, but we don't want to see it in front of our face.
Yeah.
And
That's when you were making the distinction between
and
racism and racial discrimination.
And I think that's real, so that you can kill millions of people then, for the sake of rubber tires, and inner tubes for your bikes. And like I said, cheap bananas. And we still are fine with them. And we have videos that are made, and it's not like it's turning people into, radical, anti, corporation, fanatics. We have people who love true crime, and it's not turning people into like, prison abolition, enthusiasts, if we can call that and it's something to be enthused about. But you know what I mean? Like, it's not turning people, so we can know about wrongful convictions, wrongful incarceration, and but it's happening there. If it's in our face, it's a whole nother thing. I have another, undergrad student who's working on looking at comparisons between, with lynching and rape allegations, specifically looking at death penalty and so forth. And it's a whole nother thing to say, like, yes, this person needs to get the chair, or lethal injection. There's a whole nother thing to sit and watch a lethal injection piece. And unfortunately, I did do that, and you're just not the same. You can't, and I could see in the room, because they don't allow you to speak or whatever else. I can see in the room, even the families of the people who the person is killed, they don't come out of there like cheering, because it's horrendous, especially if it gets botched. So again, when the violence in front of your face, you may not tolerate it, but you definitely don't want to see it. But when it's somewhere else, you'll be fine with it always happening. And so in the case of this question that you have, it doesn't really matter if it's police or vigilante. It'll be allowed, but it's still being done for the sake of keeping the money flowing.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was you, Russell, who said something, and I really did start seeing it this way, about thinking about racism as benign, or thinking about these things in general as benign, and or apathy towards things, as opposed to the tendency to always feel like, this is some of my issue with anti-blackness sometimes, is a tendency to think that the world is always thinking about you, and that you are the primary target, like on purpose, not as an accident, not as a kind of benign neglect, but as like, people walk in the room with the intent of killing you. And again, but then at the same time, funny enough, thinking about, over the course of these 3 hours we've been on here, but but at the same time, not really dealing with the people who actually do approach it as not as benign, but actually are like, no, we are going to abduct you as you walk out of your office. But most of the time, this stuff is benign. It's benign. It's not it is, I'm willing to I'm willing to sacrifice this for that, or I just simply don't care about that group, because that's why I was saying about the hegemonic part of it, because a lot of those kind of, for lack of a better term, white supremacist ideals have like watered down how you may view a population. So you're willing, like they've been dehumanized in a sense. So I can use those as a rationalization for why 30 million people can die, for why, children can be starved, for all of that. And that doesn't necessarily just apply to like black folks. I'm saying that can apply to any group who's dehumanized, but I can use that as a rationalization, especially when it's not in my face. I can use it as a rationalization to say, well, they didn't really deserve anything anyway, or whatever. But it's a passing thought as you move on to watch Netflix, right? It's a passing thought as you look at your phone and see a notification and you don't click on it. It's a passing thought as you pick your child up or whatever you're going to do. Like it's not that you're actively engaged in the genocide. And that's another thing you could say, well, I didn't do it. I'm not the one dropping the bomb. I'm not the one, so I don't have to feel any kind of relationship to it, right? Like it's that constant sense of being able to displace it somewhere else. But I think more things are that than they are oh my god, the black people I gotta kill them. Like it's like once that switch was made, a lot of things made more sense, because it's not that people are like bleeding or like foaming at the mouth in all cases. It's like that's not actually what it is. It's if I go to try to get a home somewhere, there's already these stereotypes about me, and it's just kind of like, well, I don't really want to do. I'm not gonna deal with him. I'll deal with the white person over that. It's not that they are actively like, I want to oppress you and put your family out on the street. It's not. I don't think that if we are gonna deal with any kind of psychology at all, I don't think that's really the approach. Now there are people who have that position, but I'm just saying, like, I don't normally take these things personal in that sense. Like it's just kind of like I think when we first had this conversation, it was about when you walk into a restaurant and like just a very casual racism thing. Black men, we walk into a restaurant and it's just like people will just not come to the front to like, seat you or something. Like, but it's not because the servers are like actively engaged and it's like, I want to make him feel like shit. It's just like, he's not going to tip me. I'm not,
I mean,
or yeah.
I mean, how different is David Lane's 14 words? We must secure the existence of our people and the future for white children from I'll do anything for my child. We hear that. I mean, those of us who've been in education have heard that from parents so much, and some parents really mean that, which mean, and when they really mean, and they really mean it in relationship to not just mild situations in which their child failed a class, but no, their child has raped somebody on a college campus. I'm going to do everything possible. I know they committed something wrong, but I'm going to make sure they don't go to prison. So I'm going to spend the money and put up the house, the mortgage on the house, to hire an attorney to prevent them from, going to jail for this. I don't want to mess up their future. But who cares about, the victim's future? So like, again, it's important to sort of think about, again, these things in this way, but starting first with their perspective, because you begin to, when you hear their perspective, it's not like we're humanizing white nationalists. You're now seeing it in a very basic sense. And, when I finally first came across the 14 words, it did just read just like that basic point that I've heard parents say. I mean, I'm not a parent, so I haven't been propelled to move to that particular point of thinking, but I've heard it, and whenever I heard it, I was like, really, anything, and no, you have parents that say, I will do anything for my child, and they mean that, and it's not just some basic thing of, if they're hungry, I'm gonna go without. Like, no, they really mean they're going to cover up things, they're going to overlook things, they're going to enable things. Yeah. So I just want to kind of, throw that out there.
All right. Well, thank you guys
Oh, no,
for
thank you,
doing
man.
this.
Thank you.
This has been
Yeah, thank you.
appreciated. It's been a great discussion. And I definitely want to make sure people, especially on Millennials, if you're watching it with us, make sure you head over to Black Myths Podcast, check out these earlier episodes. You know, I learned a lot watching all 4 of the ones that I watched, and I know there's more on the Black Myths Patreon too. So if you want the 15-hour version or
The Snyder Cut. The Snyder Cut.
yeah, the Snyder Cut. Yeah,
Snyder Cut.
yeah. Head over to the Black Myths Patreon and support that. But
Snyder Cut soon to be owned by Paramount or
all right. Well, appreciate you both. This was great. And would always love to do more. And it's been great to collaborate with you on this episode.
No doubt.
All right, peace.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.